The book is smaller than it has any right to be, given how long it has lasted. 81 short chapters, about 5,000 characters in the original, small enough to read through in an hour. It has been carried into English more than 100 times, by more than 100 different hands, and no two of those versions agree about what it says. The man whose name is on it is called Lao Tzu, and that is not a name. It is a title. It means old master, though the characters will just as readily yield old child, which is stranger and maybe closer. Nobody knows who he was, and nobody ever has. That is not a hole in the record. It may be the point. The book is called the Tao Te Ching, Tao Te Ching, and the T at the front of Tao is spoken as a D, which is the first thing most people get wrong about it, and nowhere near the last. It opens with a line that has been unsettling readers for 2,000 years, because the line dismantles the book before the book has properly begun. The way that can be spoken of is not the constant way. Whatever this is about, it cannot be said. And then, having said so, it goes on to say 5,000 words more. The first person to attempt a serious life of the author was a historian named Sima Qian, Su Ma Qian, writing about 400 years after the fact, and he was not a careless man. He had chosen mutilation over abandoning his history. He wrote about emperors and wars and the movement of money with a precision that scholars still rely on. When he arrived at this one life, he gathered what there was and set out 3 separate candidates. An archivist at the royal court who was said to have met Confucius, a second man from the same region who wrote a book in 15 sections and may or may not have been the first, and a court astrologer who lived more than a century later and cannot possibly have been either. He weighed them against each other. Then he wrote that nobody in his age could know whether any of it was so. He did not force it. He closed the entry with a phrase that has hung over everything since, set down in the flat tone of a man recording a fact. Lao Tzu, he wrote, was a hidden gentleman. I have gone back to that line more times than I can properly account for, and I still cannot decide whether Sima Qian meant it as an apology or as the answer. The tradition settled on the first of the 3, and what it remembers about him is odd enough to be worth holding on to. The man was a librarian. He was the keeper of the royal archives, which is to say that he spent his working life surrounded by the accumulated writing of an entire dynasty, shelf upon shelf of everything anyone had thought worth keeping. And the book that carries his name says that whoever wants to follow the way must put something down every day and then put down more until there is nothing left to force and nothing left undone. That book went on to run an empire. Non-action became the working policy of the Han court, argued for at the highest level and applied to the government of tens of millions of people. Then it went further and turned into a religion, with the author himself installed inside it as a god, seated on an altar and receiving incense, which is a peculiar career for a man who wrote that anything which can be named is not the real thing. Tonight we have all of it. Everything this quiet 5,000-word mind worked out, and the place, near the end, where it turns around and takes issue with itself. The questions underneath it are simple to state and very hard to answer. Is there a way of getting something done that does not involve forcing it? Is there a kind of strength that works by giving way instead of pushing back? He spent a lifetime on both, and the answers he arrived at were strange enough that people have been arguing about them ever since, usually while misquoting him. None of that needs settling tonight. It is late, and you are lying in the dark, and this is one of the very few books in the world that would actively approve of you not trying. It was written by somebody who thought that most of what we do is unnecessary effort, and that things go on running perfectly well the moment we stop gripping them. So there is nothing to work out here, and nothing you need to keep hold of. Your breathing slows on its own if you leave it alone, and you do not have to help it. That is very nearly the whole argument, and you can practice it lying still with your eyes closed while somebody else does the talking. If work like this seems worth making, subscribing helps more than almost anything else. And one question to carry, if you are still awake enough to carry anything: is there a line you have been repeating for years without ever asking who said it first or what they meant by it? I read the answers. The world this book came out of was not a calm one. It was, by a considerable margin, the bloodiest stretch of years in Chinese history, and a philosophy of yielding was assembled in the middle of it. Two armies sat down opposite each other in a valley in the north of China and stayed there for more than 2 years. They were not fighting for most of it. They were eating. An army of that size has to be fed from somewhere, and the somewhere was the farmland of 2 enormous states whose grain came north in carts month after month for longer than either of them could comfortably afford. This was the new shape of war, and it was only about a century old. 200 years earlier, fighting in China had been a seasonal and almost ceremonial business, conducted by aristocrats in chariots, with rules about when you were permitted to attack and whom you were permitted to kill, and it tended to be finished by the evening. By the time of the valley, a single state could put 1 million men under arms and keep them there through 2 winters. The valley was called Changping. The army on one side belonged to the state of Qin, which most of the world's languages would eventually borrow as the name for the entire country. The army on the other belonged to Zhao, and it was about to stop existing. It ended in 260 BC. The Zhao force was cut off from its supply, held out as long as men can, and surrendered. Something in the region of 400,000 of them laid down what they were carrying, and the Qin commander had almost all of them killed. The figure that comes down to us is 450,000 dead on the Zhao side across the whole campaign, and something like 250,000 on the side that won. We have it from Sima Qian, who compiled the standard history of these centuries about 150 years afterwards, and who is the reason anyone knows anything at all about them. Historians argue over whether the numbers are inflated. Nobody argues that it was small. 450,000 is not a quantity a person can feel. You can read it and understand perfectly well that it is terrible, and then notice that the understanding is happening somewhere behind your eyes and is not traveling any further down than that. The mind does something practical with figures on that scale. It files them and gets on with the day. So the only way in is smaller, and smaller means this. For Changping, Qin called up every male over the age of 15, which was unusual even by the standards of that century and which people at the time remarked on. 15. If you want to stand anywhere in that valley, stand there, old enough by a single year, in a line being counted, in the 3rd year of a war that had so far consisted of waiting. The unravelling that produced all this had been running for 500 years. The royal house of Zhou, once held real authority over the whole Chinese world, and somewhere around 770 BC, it lost that authority in the way these things are usually lost, by degrees, and then all at once. What remained was the shape of a kingdom with nothing inside it. A king still addressed as king, and more than 100 territories that had quietly stopped listening to him. They spent the following centuries absorbing one another. With each generation, there were fewer states, and each of them was larger, and the wars between them grew in proportion until 7 were left, and then in that valley effectively 1. A collapsing court has one curious side effect. Learning gets out. For centuries, knowing things in China had been a function of the palace. Records, ritual, astronomy, the calendar, all of it held by officials who were born into the work and passed it to their sons. When the palace stopped mattering, the knowledge walked out of the building. Private teachers began taking students who had no business being taught. Schools opened that answered to nobody, and a class of person came into existence who had not existed before. Educated men with no land, no title, and nothing to sell but their judgment, walking from capital to capital and offering counsel to whichever ruler would house and feed them. They were all answering the same commission, and the commission was, "This is killing us. What do we do?" Confucius, a couple of centuries before the Valley, had answered that the cure was to go backwards, take the old courtesies seriously again, rebuild character deliberately and from childhood until you had men who simply would not want to do this. Another school held that the answer was impartial concern for every living person, combined with much better city walls. And the school that eventually won held that the answer was law, precise, published, applied to everyone without exception, and enforced with punishments frightening enough that no one would test them twice. That last one was the working philosophy of Qin, which is a considerable part of why Qin was the state still standing at the end. Somewhere in the middle of all this, a set of sayings was circulating that answered the question by declining its terms. The tradition places Lao Tzu 2 centuries earlier in a marginally quieter age, but the book that carries his name was still settling into the form we have during precisely these decades, and whoever was doing the settling had all of this in front of them. The oldest copy anyone has ever recovered from the ground was buried around 300 BC, which is 40 years before the Valley, in a country that already knew what was coming. What that book says, in one after another, is that the hard thing loses. Nothing in the world is softer than water, it says, and nothing is better than water at wearing down what is hard and strong. The stiff and the unyielding belong to death. The soft and the yielding belong to life. The best ruler is the one the people barely know is there, who finishes the work and leaves them saying that they did it themselves. Printed on a calendar page, that is a pleasant sentiment. Read in the year 260 BC, 3 years into a war that consumed the harvest of 2 provinces and ended in a mass grave, it stops being a sentiment and turns into a proposal, put forward in an emergency by somebody who had been watching the alternative for a very long time and had concluded that it did not work. The emergency answered him immediately, and without any ambiguity at all. Qin did not soften, it did the reverse, and it did it thoroughly. It standardized weights and axle widths and the writing system, and it organized an entire state around the feeding of an army. And then between 230 and 221 BC, in the space of 9 years, it took every remaining kingdom in China and placed them under one administration for the first time in the history of the world. The soft did not overcome the hard at Changping. The hard overcame everything on schedule, and the people writing about yielding were writing from the losing side of the most decisive military result in the ancient world. There is a consolation available at this point, and I am not going to reach for it because it is not quite honest. It is true that the empire Qin built came apart about 15 years after it was completed. It is also true that 450,000 men were dead either way, and that no argument about the long run was worth anything whatsoever to any of them. But the book was never making a prediction about who would win the war, and that took me an embarrassingly long time to see. It does not claim that the gentle state defeats the ruthless one in the field. It hardly mentions the field. What it keeps circling in one form after another is a different question altogether, which is what winning does to the winner, what a state has to turn itself into before an afternoon like that one becomes possible, and whether anything that has turned itself into that ever gets to put it down again. Sima Qian could give the dead at Changping to the nearest 10,000. He could not give a straight answer about who Lao Tzu was. I have stopped expecting those 2 facts to resolve into one another, and I have mostly stopped minding. One number is exact and impossible to feel. One man is vague and somehow entirely present. They sit there next to each other, and neither gives way. Nothing is happening in the room you are in. It seems worth noticing that for a moment before you let it go, nobody being counted, nothing moving on any road, the loudest thing within reach of you, almost certainly, your own breathing. That valley is 2,300 years away, and the quiet you are lying in is not nothing. It has not always been available. The question that world put to everyone alive in it was how to hold on. There is one story about a man who answered it by letting go of the whole arrangement and walking west. The person who does the most important thing in this story was a minor official whose job was to write down the names of people leaving. Every state in that century had passes because the country is mountainous and there are only so many ways through it, and where there is only one way through, somebody builds a gate across it and puts a garrison behind the gate. The work was customs and control. You recorded what went out and what came in, you took what was owed, and you decided who was permitted through and who was going to have a difficult afternoon. It was not a distinguished posting. Nothing about it required you to be a good judge of character. The tradition later fixed on a particular pass, the one at Hangu, a defile so narrow that a small force could hold it against an army, which is exactly the kind of place that ends up with a gate across it. The story goes that late in his life, having spent decades in the service of a court he had watched go rotten from the inside, the keeper of the royal archives resigned his post, packed almost nothing, and started walking west. West meant out. Beyond the passes there was no other kingdom, only the edge of the world as anyone in China then understood the world, and a man heading in that direction at that age was not travelling anywhere. He was leaving. He came to the last gate, and the official on duty, whose name comes down to us as Yin Shi, looked at the old man, waiting to be processed, recognized something, and did the single most consequential thing any minor bureaucrat has ever done in the history of the world. He refused to raise the barrier, not out of malice and not for money. The condition he set was that the old man was not going anywhere until he had written it down. Whatever it is that you know, put it on something I can keep. It is worth standing where the gatekeeper stood, because it is a stranger place than it looks from outside. He is on duty. There is a queue behind the old man. He has no authority whatsoever to detain a traveller for philosophical reasons, and no procedure he could point to if anyone asked. He has to look at somebody he has almost certainly never met before and decide, in roughly the time it takes to check a document, that this particular person is carrying something that will be gone from the world in a few years if he is allowed to walk through. And then he has to say that out loud to the man's face and mean it firmly enough to keep the gate shut while he says it. Most of us would have stamped the thing and turned to the next man in line. So the old man sat down and wrote. The account is very sparing about how. He produced a book in 2 parts, one on the way and one on the power that comes of keeping to it, and it ran to somewhere around 5,000 characters. Then he handed it across, went through the gate, and the record simply stops. Everyone knows the picture, incidentally, the old man on the back of a water buffalo, beard down his chest, moving away from us up a mountain road with the animal's head down. It is on scrolls and porcelain and temple walls, and it is probably the most reproduced image of a philosopher anywhere in Chinese art. There is no buffalo in the earliest account. There is no description of the man at all, in fact. No age, no face, no clothing, nothing whatsoever that anybody could draw. The animal arrives centuries afterwards, and the oldest securely dated painting of that meeting at the pass is from around the 16th century, which means the painter was further away from the afternoon he was painting than we are from the painter. A picture was needed. One was eventually supplied. The most likely truth is that none of it happened. The book is now generally read as an anthology, a collection of sayings. A great many of them rhymed, most of them probably spoken and carried in memory long before anybody committed them to bamboo, gathered and arranged and rearranged across generations by editors whose names nobody has. On that account, there was no afternoon at the gate, because there was no single afternoon in which any of it was composed. There was a slow accumulation, the way a language accumulates, and at some point somebody drew a line around the pile and called it a book. And there is a second objection, which I find considerably more interesting than the first, because it takes the story seriously and then follows it somewhere uncomfortable. Suppose it did happen. Suppose a man really was stopped at a border and told he could not leave until he had written out what he knew. Then what we have is a document produced under duress by somebody who had made a deliberate decision to stop talking, extracted from him by a stranger with the power to keep him standing there and handed over in exchange for permission to go. Every word of it was written by a man who wanted to be somewhere else. That is not a flattering origin for a sacred text, and it is not obviously a reliable one either. There is something in the scene that anybody who has ever been asked to explain themselves will recognize. You know a thing. You have known it long enough that it has stopped being a thought and turned into the way you do things, which is a different and better kind of knowing. Then somebody asks you to say what it is, and you open your mouth, and what comes out is noticeably thinner than what you had. The knowing does not survive the journey into words. A good half of what that man is supposed to have written is about precisely this problem, which is either the finest joke in the history of philosophy or the most honest complaint ever registered. Which brings me to the part of the story I have come to think is the actual point of it. A tradition invents the origin it needs, and what this one needed was an explanation for why the book exists at all, because by its own account it should not. The text says in several places that the people who understand are not the ones doing the talking, that polished words are not to be trusted, and that the thing it is about cannot be put into language in the first place. A book holding those opinions has a serious problem the moment it runs to 5,000 characters. So the story does something quietly ingenious with the difficulty. It makes the writing involuntary. He never set out to produce anything. He was detained until he produced it. The responsibility belongs to the man at the gate. Whether or not anyone ever stood at that barrier, somebody along the line understood that the book was going to need an alibi. The tradition could not leave the official alone either. Later accounts promote him from bureaucrat to disciple, and then from disciple to immortal, and one version has him sent away to study and to wait for a summons that will reach him years later in the middle of a marketplace. He gets an entire eternity out of one decision made at a gate on an ordinary working day, which seems about right. It is a story about somebody who was nearly finished and was made to do one more thing before he was allowed to rest. And that is not the worst thing to be holding at this hour. Whatever is still on your list is not going anywhere. The gate is not going to close. Your hands stopped a while ago. They tend to go first, and the only work being done tonight is being done by somebody else. What survives of that afternoon is beautiful, and almost none of it will bear weight. Not the buffalo, not the pass, not the two neat halves of the book, and least of all the man who is supposed to have been standing there, about whose identity the record is not merely silent, but unhelpfully talkative in three directions at once. In 99 BC, a historian at the Han court spoke up in defense of a general who had surrendered to the enemy and was condemned to death for it. There were two ways out of a sentence like that. One was a payment he could not raise. The other was castration, which a man of his rank was expected to decline in favor of killing himself, and which he accepted. He explained why in a letter that has survived. The book was not finished. What he built over the years that followed is the foundation everything else in Chinese historical writing stands on. 130 chapters reaching from the legendary emperors down to the court he was sitting in, arranged into annals, tables, treatises, the houses of the great families, and a long sequence of individual lives. He is precise about grain prices and river works and the order in which armies moved. He gives the year and the month where he has it, and the name of the officer. He had already made a decision about what his own body was worth against the value of getting this right, and it shows on every page of it. Then he reaches one particular life, and the machinery stops turning. The difficulty was not a shortage of sources. It was that he had several, and they would not lie flat. There was a figure called Lao Dan, whose second name means something close to long ears, which was read at the time as a physical mark of an unusually long life. Lao Dan appears in older texts as an authority on ceremony, quoted on the correct conduct of funerals in a tone that assumes the reader knows perfectly well who is meant. There was a man from the south who had written a book in 15 sections, and whom some people insisted was the same person. And there was a court astrologer, also called Dan, turning up in the records more than a century later to make a political prophecy to a Western duke, who cannot possibly be the first man unless you are willing to accept some very generous arithmetic. To his credit, the historian tells you what people were saying about the arithmetic. He records that the man lived 160 years, or perhaps 200, on account of having cultivated the way. He does not endorse this. He includes it because it was in the material in front of him, which is a specific and rather admirable kind of honesty. Here is everything I found, including the part I do not believe. He also, remarkably, supplies a family tree. He cannot tell you which of the three men wrote the book, but he can hand you a line of descent running down through the generations to somebody drawing a salary at the Han court in his own lifetime. A family was still making the claim. He wrote the claim down. There is one scene the tradition held onto, and it is the best thing in the entire file. Confucius, still young and still assembling his method, travels to consult the old archivist about ritual, which is Confucius's own subject, the thing he has staked his whole life on. He wants technical guidance on ceremony from the man who keeps the records of how ceremony has always been done. What he gets is not guidance. He is told that the men he so admires are dead, that their bones rotted a long time ago and only their sentences are left, that a good merchant keeps his stock out of sight and looks like a man with nothing, and that the ambition and the appetite and the carefully arranged expression on his face are doing him no good whatsoever. Put them down. That is the whole of my advice. Confucius goes back to his students and says something they evidently never forgot, since it is the part everybody preserved. Birds fly, he tells them, and I know how to bring one down. Fish swim, and I know how to net them. Animals run, and I know how to set a trap. But the dragon rides the wind and the clouds and goes up into the sky, and I have no idea at all how it manages that. Today, I have seen Lao Tzu, and he is a dragon. It almost certainly never happened. Confucius died in 479 BC, and the earliest surviving version of that meeting comes from a text assembled a good 2 centuries afterwards by people with an obvious interest in how it came out. The scene exists because somebody wanted a particular fact on the record, that the most respected teacher in China went to this man for instruction and came away flattened. It is a demolition with a date on it, and the date is long after both men were in the ground. There is a further wrinkle, and it does more damage than any of the others. So far as anything surviving shows, nobody connected this man to that book for a very long time. The sayings circulated, the names circulated. The earliest texts we have that put the two together come from around the 3rd century BC, centuries after he is supposed to have lived, and it is the historian at the Han court who makes the attribution official. Before that, the book is a book, And Lao Dan is a name people reach for when they want a saying to sound older than they are. Modern scholarship pushes past even that, and where it ends up is genuinely disorienting. If the thing was assembled rather than composed, worked over by a succession of hands until it held together, then the question of who wrote it may not have an answer in the shape the question expects. There is no single mind behind it, the way there is a single mind behind a letter. But somebody chose, and that is where I keep snagging. A collection is not an accident. Somebody decided that this saying belonged beside that one, that this passage stopped here rather than 4 lines further on, that the opening move would be a warning against the whole undertaking. Those are authorial decisions, even if the person making them never wrote a line of the raw material. There was a taste at work, and the taste is consistent enough that 5,000 characters sound like one person talking, which is more than can be said for plenty of books with a single name on the cover. Try it with a name you have said all your life. Repeat it a few times over, out loud or not, and it comes unstuck from the person faster than you would expect. First it goes strange in the mouth, and then it stops meaning anybody at all and becomes 2 sounds you happen to be familiar with. Almost everyone has done this by accident, usually with their own name, usually somewhere around this hour of the night. The person does not go anywhere while it is happening. It is the label that comes off. And there is a decision sitting inside all of this that is worth trying on because people meet smaller versions of it constantly. He could have picked one. He had 3 candidates, a readership that wanted an answer, and the authority to settle the matter. Nobody would have checked, and in fact, nobody did check for 2,000 years. A tidy paragraph naming one man would have cost him nothing at all. Instead, he wrote down that no one in his age could know, and left the mess sitting in the record where anybody could find it. That is not the comfortable option, and if you have ever had to say out loud that you were not sure when a confident answer was available and would have been accepted, you know roughly what it goes for. What I cannot settle, and I have come at it from several angles, is whether any of it was deliberate. The book opens by saying that names do not hold the things that matter. The title on it is not a name but a description of an old person. The one biographical detail every version agrees on is that the man's entire practice was self-effacement and having no reputation, and the record, when you finally lean on it, gives you 3 shadows and no one standing in them. Somewhere along that sequence, accident stops being a sufficient explanation and starts to look like a preference, his or his copyists, or both, sustained over so long a stretch that the distinction stops meaning much. I cannot prove any of that. It may simply be that an obscure man's name was lost, the way almost all names are lost, and that everything since is people finding significance in a whole because wholes invite it. That is the dull answer, and it may well be the correct one. I notice that I do not believe it, and I notice equally that my not believing it is not evidence of anything, which leaves the book sitting there without an owner, and the first word in it is one that nobody has ever managed to carry intact into another language. You may find, if you are drifting by now, that the question gets easier rather than harder on the way down. Wide awake, not knowing who wrote something is an itch. There is a gap where a fact ought to be, and the mind keeps going back to press on it. Closer to sleep, the pressing stops. Names are among the first things to loosen as you go under, and you have almost certainly had the experience of losing somebody's name right at the edge and not minding in the least, the face perfectly clear while the label drifts off it. That is very close to the state this book spends 5,000 characters recommending. You are probably 20 minutes away from it, whether or not you approve. Somewhere close to where you live, there is a path that nobody built. It cuts across a corner of grass between 2 pavements, or runs diagonally over a lawn towards a door, and it is bare brown earth where everything on either side of it is green. No one drew it. No committee approved the route. There was a right angle somewhere that people quietly declined to walk, and enough of them declined it, often enough, over enough wet autumns, that the ground eventually gave up and showed the line. What is remarkable about a path like that is not that it exists, but how good it is. It is nearly always the correct route, the shortest sensible line between where people actually are and where they actually want to get to, with the slope accounted for and the puddle avoided, and the awkward route at the base of the tree worked around by 10,000 small adjustments that nobody made on purpose and nobody wrote down. Some landscape planners have learned to stop guessing, wait a year, and then pave whatever the feet have found because the route that appears is reliably better than the one on the drawing. The Chinese word for a path like that is Tao, and the first thing worth knowing is that it is not a mystical term. It is a road. It is the ordinary word you would use for the track between two villages, the thing you walk on, the thing that has mud on it. And it carries a second everyday sense as well, which is the way a person does something, their method, their manner, the particular style of a cook or a carpenter or a swordsman. English happens to be unusually lucky here because our own word way carries exactly the same double load. There is the way to the station and there is the way she holds a cup, and nobody has ever found it confusing that those are the same word. You can recognize somebody you know from 200 yards off by the way they walk, well before you can make out a single feature of the face. You could not write down what you recognized. There was no list of characteristics that you consulted and no measurement you took. Something about the whole arrangement in motion is unmistakably them, and it is not held anywhere inside you as information. Now, the part that makes the book what it is, that same word has a third sense in classical Chinese. Along with road and along with manner, it means to speak, to put a thing into words, to say. So the opening line of the Tao Te Ching, which is 6 characters long, uses one word 3 times over in 3 different senses, and if you render it flat, it comes out as something close to, the way that can be way-ed is not the constant way, the road that can be roaded, or nearest to what the sentence is actually doing, the way that can be spoken is not the enduring way. It is a pun. The most famous opening sentence in Chinese philosophy turns on a pun, and the pun is load-bearing. It is not ornament sitting on top of a thought, it is the thought. Travelling the road and talking about the road are the same verb, and the sentence exists to say that the second one is not the first. 24 chapters further in, he attempts to introduce the subject properly, and you can hear him working out how to handle the problem he has made for himself. There was something formless and complete, he says, which existed before heaven and earth, silent and empty, standing alone and not changing, going everywhere without wearing out. It might be called the mother of everything. And then, I do not know its name. That is a line sitting in a canonical text from the figure an entire tradition is built on, admitting ignorance about his own central subject. He carries on regardless. Obliged to call it something, he says, I call it the way. Pressed for a proper name, I would call it the great. He is showing his working. He is telling you outright that the label was a convenience adopted under pressure and that you should hold it about that loosely. He closes the passage with a short chain that is easy to read straight past. Human beings take their pattern from the earth. The earth takes its pattern from the sky. The sky takes its pattern from the way, and the way takes its pattern from what is so of itself. The ladder climbs and climbs, and then, at the top, stops pointing at anything. There is no further authority up there. The way does not answer to a lawgiver because, at the end of the sequence, there is nothing except the fact that things are as they are, by themselves, with no instruction having been issued. This is where the Western ear tends to slip, and it slips in a consistent direction. The vocabulary, a formless thing before heaven and earth, the mother of all things, the source, sounds so much like the opening of Genesis that the reflex is to hear a god being described in unfamiliar clothing. It is not a god. It wants nothing. It has no preferences, issues no instructions, keeps no accounts, and rewards nobody, and it is not watching. Nearer to what the book seems to mean is something like this. There is a way things go, and the way things go was not arranged by anyone. Translators have felt the strain of it. The word has been carried into English as way, as path, as reason, as nature, and more than once by people who could not stop themselves as God. Every one of those choices imports a set of commitments the original never makes, which is a good part of why so many people have attempted it, and why none of the attempts has settled anything. And here is the strongest objection available, which is not the obvious complaint about a silent book that runs to 5,000 characters. A claim that cannot be stated, cannot be tested. If every formulation of the way is by definition a failed formulation, then no criticism will ever land, because any objection at all can be answered by saying that the objector has caught the words and missed the thing. That is an extremely comfortable position and an impossible one to argue against. Ideas built that way have a habit of lasting a very long time without ever having to be correct, and there is a version of this book, the version on the calendar page, the one that turns out to agree with whatever you already thought, which survives on exactly that footing. The unsayable makes a superb hiding place. I do not think the book is doing that. I want to be straight with you that I cannot prove it isn't, and that nobody else can either. There is a smaller form of the same difficulty that people run into constantly without noticing. It is philosophy. You have something true and unspoken. You have worked out that you are in love, or that you are going to leave the job, or that a friendship has been finished for about a year. It exists perfectly well in the unsaid condition. And then a moment arrives where you have to decide whether to put it into a sentence, out loud, to somebody. And, while you are deciding that saying it will change what it is, it will acquire edges and a date. It will start having consequences. The loose, breathing, not yet finished version you are holding will not be available to you afterwards. Sometimes that is precisely what you want. Sometimes you say it and hear it land wrong and smaller and faintly untrue, and spend the next hour trying to take the corners off. The room you are in has not been named tonight, and it is doing perfectly well. There is a shape of furniture you are not looking at, a temperature you stopped registering hours ago, and a particular quality of darkness that belongs to this room and to no other, and that you could not describe to anybody who asked. You know it exactly. It has never once needed a word from you. Which leaves the practical question, and the book does eventually arrive at it. If the thing cannot be described, cannot be taught, and will not hold still long enough to be learned, what is a person actually supposed to do about it? The answer he settles on is the strangest piece of advice in the whole book, and almost everybody who has heard of it has heard it wrong. There is a decent chance you have been attempting to fall asleep for a while now, and that it has not been going especially well. The attempting is the problem, and almost everyone knows this, and knowing it has never once helped anybody. You lie still, you do the breathing, you arrange the pillow into the configuration that worked on Tuesday. And underneath all of that, there is a small administrator running a continuous assessment. Am I closer? Is this working? How long has it been? And if I go under in the next 20 minutes, do I still get 6 hours? And that administrator is the entire reason nothing is happening. Sleep is not something a person does. It is something that occurs once the person has stopped doing things. And one of the things they have to stop doing is checking whether it has started. You cannot get there by wanting it more. Wanting it more is a movement in precisely the wrong direction, There is no version of trying harder that improves the situation, and the harder you push, the further off it goes, until at 4 in the morning you can find yourself in the genuinely absurd position of being angry with yourself for failing at the one task whose only requirement is that you stop setting requirements. Sleep is the purest case, but the family of things that behave this way is larger than most people notice. You have had a name on the tip of your tongue, gone at it directly, got nothing, and then had it handed to you unrequested and complete 20 minutes later while you were washing something up. Photographers deal with the difficulty professionally. Ask a person to look natural and you will get an expression that has never occurred in nature. And there is a well-documented and quietly devastating version of it in sport, called the yips, in which a player who has made the same short putt or the same simple throw 10,000 times becomes suddenly and sometimes permanently unable to make it, because conscious attention has arrived in a movement that was never meant to be conscious. Some of them never recover it. Careers have ended that way. What ended them was thinking about it. The book has a name for the alternative, and it is the most misunderstood expression in Chinese thought. Wu Wei. Wu Wei. 2 characters. The first means not or without. The second means do or act or make, which gets rendered reasonably enough as non-action or non-doing, and that rendering has done a century of damage. Because the second character carries a further sense, the English drops entirely. Alongside act, it means something close to contrive, worked up, artificial, manufactured on purpose rather than arising by itself. So the phrase sits much nearer to acting without contrivance or doing without forcing than it does to sitting still. What is being subtracted is not the action, it is the strain. There is an even blunter formulation in the text, which turns up more than once and consists of the same character twice with the negative wedged between do without doing, act without acting. It is a paradox in the original as much as in translation. Nobody tricked him into it. He built the thing that way deliberately. So the familiar modern reading, go with the flow, stop worrying, let it be, catches something real and then mislays everything that made it interesting. The figure the book keeps describing is not idle in the least. He governs, he finishes things. Work gets completed around him and problems get dealt with, and the text is insistent that the results are better than what forcing produces. What is being recommended is not a smaller quantity of activity. It is the removal of something that rides along on top of activity and contributes nothing, which is invisible from the inside, and which is considerably harder to take off than it was to put on. He describes the whole business as a subtraction rather than an acquisition, and the phrase he uses doubles back on itself, dropped and then dropped again, which quietly converts it from a destination into a practice. There is no finished version of this. There is only the continuing removal. And now the difficulty that has followed the idea around for 2,500 years, which nobody has ever managed to dispose of. How do you try not to try? If the condition you are after is one of not striving, then striving towards it defeats itself in the most exact way imaginable. Every effort you make to become unforced is itself an effort. Every morning you wake and resolve to be more spontaneous today, you have already lost, because a resolution is the wrong species of thing. And you cannot arrive by not trying either, because if you had been the sort of person capable of not trying, you would never have needed the instruction in the first place. The philosopher Edward Slingerland calls this the paradox of Wu Wei, and he argues that it is not a small embarrassment at the edge of the system, but the engine sitting underneath the whole of early Chinese philosophy, the problem every school of that century was circling in one form or another, and that none of them closed. How do you get a person to be genuinely, unself-consciously good when the getting is itself a self-conscious act? Confucius has a version of the difficulty. This book has a version. Nobody solved it, And the fact that nobody solved it is a considerable part of why the argument ran on for another 2,000 years. There is a second objection with a harder edge, and it was being made at the time. Mozi M. Ward Zhu ran the most practical school of that century. His people were engineers and organizers. They specialized in defensive fortification and would travel to a besieged city to help it hold out. Their position was that the test of any doctrine is whether it feeds people, and that the correct principle is impartial care, in which everyone's parent is treated as your parent and everyone's child as your child, with the accounting done in lives. From inside that view, a philosophy of not forcing looks like something a comfortable man says. While you are declining to interfere, a harvest is failing somewhere, and a city is being reduced somewhere else. Non-contrivance builds no walls and digs no wells. It is a doctrine that costs its holder very little and its neighbours a great deal, and it has always had a way of appealing most to people who are doing perfectly well already. There is one place where the paradox has been not resolved but harnessed, and it is worth knowing about tonight in particular. In sleep medicine, there is a recognized behavioral technique called paradoxical intention. The instruction given to the patient is to get into bed, lie down in the dark, and make a sincere effort to stay awake, not as a trick played on themselves, but genuinely to remain conscious as long as they can manage. A substantial number of people who have not slept properly in months fall asleep faster doing this than they ever did trying to sleep, because the effort has been pointed at a target where it can no longer do any harm. You cannot hold sleep at arm's length by reaching for it if the thing you are reaching for is wakefulness. The technique comes from Viktor Frankl, who developed it for anxiety in the middle of the last century, and it now sits in the standard toolkit for chronic insomnia. It is also, quite precisely, a 2,500-year-old Chinese idea with clinical evidence attached. What I have never been able to work out is how far any of that generalizes. It plainly holds for sleep, because sleep is a system that runs perfectly well unsupervised and is only ever damaged by management. But a great deal of life is not built that way. Most things worth having demand sustained, deliberate, thoroughly unpleasant effort applied over years, and the people who tell you otherwise are usually selling something. I do not know where the line falls between the two kinds of thing. I am not certain the book knows either, and I notice that it never once says. He does give a picture of what all this looks like when it is working, and he took it from the commonest substance on earth, something with no strength of any kind, which has nonetheless got its way with every rock it has ever met, mainly by agreeing to go lower than them. Whatever you were intending to sort out tonight can be sorted out in daylight, or it can stay unsorted, and both of those turn out to be survivable. The thing you keep turning over will be exactly where you left it in the morning, none the worse for having been put down, and you will have better tools for it then than you have anywhere within reach right now. There is nothing available at this hour that will not still be there at 9. Almost every ruin in the world was taken apart by rain, not by armies and not by fire, and not by the vague thing people are gesturing at when they say time. Roofs go first, because a roof is the part that holds water out, and once a roof is open, the building has perhaps a few decades left. Water gets into the mortar and quietly takes the lime out of it. It works under the floor and lifts it. It sits in the joints of the stone through one winter and comes out in the spring, having done something the stone has no way of undoing. Stand in any old abbey with sky where the ceiling used to be, and what you are looking at is the finished work of the softest, cheapest, most harmless substance available, applied with no urgency whatsoever across 400 years. The mechanism is worth knowing because it is considerably stranger than the metaphor suggests. Water does not break rock by hitting it. Water is very bad at hitting things. What water does is find a crack, and every stone has cracks, including the ones that look solid, hairlines you could not fit a sheet of paper into, and it goes inside. Then, if the temperature drops far enough, it does something that almost no other liquid on Earth does. It expands as it freezes, by about 9%. Which means the water sitting invisibly in a joint in a cathedral wall becomes, over the course of one cold night, roughly 9% too large for the space it is occupying, and levers the stone apart from the inside with a force the building has no answer to, because the building was designed to resist things pushing on it from the outside. Then it thaws and runs a little further in and waits for the following winter. Mountains come down this way, slowly. But there is no version of the contest in which the mountain wins. There is a line in the book that reads, in most versions, something like, "That which has no substance enters where there is no gap." It has generally been treated as a piece of mysticism. It also happens to be a reasonably exact description of frost weathering, set down by somebody who had no idea why it worked and had simply been watching it happen for 60 years. But the passage everybody quotes is about something else, and the something else is the part that tends to get skipped over. The highest good, he says, is like water. Water benefits all the 10,000 things, which is the Chinese way of saying everything there is, and competes with none of them. And then comes the clause carrying the weight. It settles in the places that people find distasteful. It goes to the low ground. Everything alive is trying to get up, and water is the one substance that has never once made the attempt, and that is what puts it nearer to the way than anything else in the world. What is being recommended there is not gentleness, which is easy, and which everyone already approves of. It is direction. Go down. Take the low position, the unglamorous room, the job nobody is competing for, the piece of ground people are actively trying to get off. He develops the thought into something that sounds at first like advice for a court and turns out to be sharper than that. Why are the great rivers and the sea the kings of the 100 valley streams? Because they are better than the streams at being beneath them. Everything runs downhill, and whatever is at the bottom receives all of it, without asking, without effort, and without anyone involved experiencing the arrangement as a defeat. So a ruler who wants to stand above people should speak from below them, and one who wants to be out in front should put himself at the back. And then the line that does the actual work, because he does not contend, nobody in the world is able to contend with him. There is something faintly unfair about that. You cannot beat a person who is not playing. You cannot take a position from someone who has already sat down lower than the position. The entire apparatus of competition requires two participants, and if one of them declines to be one, the machinery has nothing at all to grip. Everybody has a small version of this available to them, roughly weekly. There is an argument you could win. You have the better case, you know the sentence that would finish it, and you can feel it sitting there ready to go. And there is a moment, usually about a second and a half long, in which you decide whether to say it or to let the other person have the last word and watch the whole thing come apart because there is nothing left for it to run on. The difficulty, and I do not think the book is honest enough about this, is that from the inside you cannot reliably tell which of those you are doing. Conceding because you have seen past the argument, and conceding because you are tired and would rather not have the confrontation, feel almost exactly the same from where you are standing. Both produce the identical silence. Only one of them is wisdom, and the other is avoidance in wisdom's clothes, and there is no internal signal that separates them, which is one of three things worth saying against the whole image, and all three deserve to be put properly. The first is the timescale. Water does defeat stone, and it does so across geological periods, and you do not have one. A canyon is a magnificent argument if you happen to be a canyon. To a person with a mortgage and roughly 40 working years in them, being told that persistence beats force in the long run is a statement about a run substantially longer than theirs. A great many soft things have been comprehensively destroyed by hard things well inside a single lifetime, and no amount of eventual erosion was the slightest use to any of them. The second is more uncomfortable. Advice to take the low place has historically been dispensed in one direction overwhelmingly, and it has worked out extremely well for the people dispensing it. Read that passage from underneath as a servant or a tenant or a conscript or a wife with no right to own property, and settle in the places that people find distasteful stops sounding like liberation and start sounding like an instruction. Any philosophy that recommends yielding owes an answer to the question of who profits when it is taken up, and this one does not make much of an attempt. The third is the simplest. Water has no intentions. It is not being humble. It is not choosing the low ground out of any insight into the nature of things. It is obeying gravity, which is the only available option. To call that strength is to admire physics and then present it with a medal for character. The metaphor holds beautifully right up until the moment you ask the water why. What gets me about the passage, and it took me an embarrassingly long time to notice, is the choice. He could have had anything. He is describing the deepest thing in his system, the pattern lying underneath the world, and the images available to him at that moment in history included the sun and the mountain and the sky and the dragon and fire and the sea in one of its enormous moods. All of them were in use. All of them were within reach. He picked the thing in the cup. The stuff that comes out of the ground for nothing, that you wash in and cook with, that has no colour and no taste and no shape of its own, and that a small child can carry across a room. There is a modesty in that decision, doing as much work as the argument is, and there is a stranger reading available than the usual one. Water never wins, because water has no stake in any outcome whatsoever. What it has is exemption. Nothing opposes it, and the reason nothing opposes it is not that it overcomes opposition, but that it has quietly removed itself from the category of things to which opposition applies. It gets past a wall by not being the sort of thing walls are built for. You are lying on something that is currently holding your entire weight, and there is a fair chance you're still doing some of the work yourself. Most people are. There is usually a piece of the shoulders and something around the hips that has not accepted the situation and is still bracing very slightly against a floor which is not going anywhere. That can be let go of. Nothing is being asked of you in order to stay exactly where you are. You cannot carry water in your hand. You can carry it in a cup, and the part of the cup that does the carrying is not the clay at all. To make a wheel, you start with the hub. Not the rim, which is what people picture, and not the spokes. The hub is the block at the center, turned from a single piece of close-grained hardwood chosen because it would not split, and it was the part that took the longest and went wrong most often. Around it, you cut the mortises for the spokes, evenly spaced, everyone at the correct angle, so that when the spokes were driven home, they would carry the load without opening the block up. And then, straight through the middle of all that, you bored the hole. The hole is the wheel. Everything else on it is a means of holding that hole in the right place. If the bore is out of true by a small fraction, the wheel wobbles. And a chariot wheel that wobbles at speed destroys itself, and very possibly the man standing on it. So the bore had to be exactly round, exactly straight, exactly centered, and exactly the right size, snug enough not to rattle and loose enough to turn. Getting that right consistently is roughly a 20-year skill, which means that the most demanding work a wheelwright ever did, the thing separating the good ones from the ones you did not buy from, was the manufacture of a well-made absence. 30 spokes share a single hub, the book says, and it is the emptiness at the center that makes the wheel of any use. He does not stop there. Clay is worked into a vessel, and it is the hollow that makes the vessel of any use. Doors and windows are cut into walls to make a room, and it is the empty space that makes the room of any use. Then the summary, which runs to a handful of characters in the original and takes rather more in English. What is there provides the benefit, and what is not there provides the use. The word for the not there is wu. Wu. It is an ordinary word meaning absence or not having, and it is the same character that stands at the front of the phrase for unforced action, doing a different job here. There it meant acting without contrivance. Here it simply means the whole. The three examples are chosen with some care, and they get progressively harder to wriggle out of. The potter is the most physical of them. A thrown pot is not built up, it is opened. The clay arrives on the wheel as a solid lump. The potter's thumbs go down into the center of it while it spins, and everything after that is a matter of persuading the opening outwards and upwards. The wall of the pot is a byproduct of making the whole, and when the thing is finished and sold, it gets described by its capacity, a 2-liter jug or a half-pint cup, which is to say that we name and price ceramics by the volume of the nothing inside them. The building is where it starts to be uncomfortable because it is the whole economy of shelter. A house is a whole with an arrangement of walls around it. Property is advertised in square meters of floor, which is a measurement of vacancy. Nobody in the history of the world has bought a flat by the tonnage of its brick. There is a fourth image a few pages earlier that gets quoted less often. The space between heaven and earth, he says, is like a bellows, empty, and yet it never collapses. Work it, and more comes out of it. Anyone who has used one knows the sensation he is pointing at, which is that the thing has no contents and is nevertheless inexhaustible. You are not spending anything when you pump it. The emptiness never gets used up. You have a pair of them under your ribs, and they have been running entirely unsupervised for as long as you have been listening. The idea turns up in places the book could not possibly have anticipated. The most consequential is probably the zero. For most of the ancient world, there was no symbol for nothing, and without one, you cannot write numbers positionally. And without positional numbers, arithmetic beyond a certain size stops being something an ordinary clerk can do and becomes a specialist craft. A digit standing for the absence of a quantity had to be invented in India and carried west across centuries against real resistance from people who found the notion faintly offensive. Very nearly every calculation performed anywhere on Earth today rests on a mark, meaning there is nothing in this column. Music does the same thing with time. The rests are not gaps in the tune, they are part of the tune, and a player who does not honor them is not playing the piece. Matter itself turns out to be built the same way. An atom is overwhelmingly empty, and on the usual estimate, if you squeeze the space out of every atom in every human being currently alive, the solid remainder would sit comfortably inside a sugar cube. Now the case against, which is stronger than it looks at first. The emptiness in a pot is not a thing. It was not made, it has no properties, it required no skill, and nobody put it there. It is simply where the pot is not. And the causal work is being done entirely by the clay, which can be shown very easily. You can have the clay without the hollow, and what you get is a lump. You cannot have the hollow without the clay, and what you get is nothing whatsoever. Not a useful nothing or an available nothing, just the ordinary undifferentiated absence that fills the rest of the universe. The hollow depends on the walls in a way the walls do not depend on the hollow. To praise the whole is to take a relation and address it as though it were a substance. There is a second difficulty, which is that the move works on absolutely anything. A knife is useful because of the gap it opens in what it cuts. A shoe is useful on account of the foot-shaped nothing inside it. A sentence is useful because of the silence it interrupts. Once you notice that the operation can be performed on any object at all, it stops being an observation about the world and turns into a habit of phrasing. And a habit of phrasing that reliably produces sentences which sound deep is precisely the sort of thing worth being suspicious of. And yet the version that survives all of that is not about objects. It is about making room, which is a real activity, demands genuine skill, and is one of the very few things nobody gets any credit for. The best editor working is the one whose contribution you cannot see, because it consists of the paragraphs that are not in the book. A surgeon's hardest professional decision is frequently the operation not performed. A teacher who has learned to sit through the 10 seconds of silence after a question instead of rushing to fill it will get better answers than one who cannot stand the pause, and it is the silence that is doing the teaching. A parent who steps back at the right moment produces a competent adult. A parent who steps back at slightly the wrong moment produces a catastrophe. And the distance between those two is a piece of judgment that cannot really be taught to anybody. All of that is work. None of it can be exhibited. You cannot put an absence on a list of your achievements. And there is no way of saying what I did was refrain that comes out sounding like anything other than an excuse. It is worth noticing, incidentally, that this is the one passage in the book that engineers tend to like. There is no mysticism anywhere in it. It is 3 worked examples and a conclusion, arranged in ascending order of difficulty by somebody who had plainly spent time standing near a wheelwright's bench and a potter's wheel and had thought hard about what he was looking at. Whatever else the man was, he did not spend his life indoors. The room you are lying in is very largely nothing. Take out the furniture and the walls and the person, and what is left is most of it. A volume of dark air doing nothing at all, requiring nothing, holding no opinion. That nothing is the reason the room works. It is what you are breathing. It is what the sound of this has to cross in order to reach you. And for the next several hours, it is the whole of what is being asked of you, which is to occupy a space with no demands in it and no edges you can feel. Nothing in this room has been decided yet. That happens to be the most comfortable condition available to anything, and there is one more image in the book prized for exactly that reason. A piece of wood that nobody has done anything to. The grip arrives before almost anything else does. A newborn has essentially no usable strength. The neck will not hold the head up. The legs do nothing whatsoever. The entire arrangement is soft and provisional and cannot be left alone for a minute. And then you lay a finger across the palm of one hand, and the hand closes on it with a force that is genuinely startling the first time you feel it, tight and immediate and quite difficult to open again without deliberately prizing the fingers back. It is strong enough that a small baby will sometimes take a portion of its own weight hanging from an adult's thumbs. It is a reflex, the palmar grasp, and it is there at birth and often before. Nobody teaches it. There is no decision anywhere inside it. And then it goes. Somewhere around 5 or 6 months it fades out, and over the following year it is replaced by grasping the child actually intends, which is more useful, more accurate, and very much weaker. The book noticed both halves of that, bones weak, sinews soft, and the grip firm, which is close to a direct quotation. And it notices something else about infants that is easy to overlook because it is so irritating, which is that a baby can cry all day without its throat going hoarse. Any adult who has shouted across a field for 10 minutes knows perfectly well that this is not normal. We wreck our voices almost at once because we push. We drive the sound out of the throat, squeeze it, force volume from a mechanism that was never built to be forced. An infant does none of that. It produces an enormous quantity of noise with no strain in it at all, using the whole body and none of the tension, which is why singing teachers will occasionally tell a student to go away and listen to a baby and then stop doing whatever it is they have been doing instead. The loudest thing in the house is the only one not trying. The word he uses for the underlying condition is poo. Poo. It is a carpenter's word or a timber merchant's. It means wood in the state it arrives in, the log as it comes down off the mountain with the bark still on it, before anyone has decided what it is going to be. Uncut, unworked, unspecified. The usual English is the uncarved block, which serves, though it makes the thing sound a good deal more solemn than the original, which is about as everyday a word as plank. And there is one line where the whole idea turns over. When the uncarved block is broken up, he says, it becomes vessels. That word for vessels, the same one used for a bowl, a pot, an implement, carries a further ordinary sense, a person with a function, a specialist, somebody good for a particular purpose, which is where something rather remarkable happens, because Confucius uses the identical word to make an argument that sounds opposed and turns out to be standing right next door. The gentleman, he says, is not a vessel, not a tool, not a device with one application, not the sort of person you take down off a shelf when that specific job comes up. Both of them are nervous about the same thing. Both are looking at a piece of timber and thinking about what disappears when it becomes a chair. What lifts this above a good image is that the carving turns out to be real and measurable, and it runs to a schedule. A human infant produces, over its first couple of years, an enormous surplus of connections in the brain, considerably more than it will carry as an adult, and development does not then proceed by adding to them. It proceeds by cutting them away. Connections that get used are kept and strengthened. Connections that go unused are eliminated, in a process running from infancy through adolescence, and by the end of it, a great deal of the original capacity has simply gone. Becoming a particular person is a subtractive operation. The clearest case is language. For roughly the first 10 months of life, a baby can hear and distinguish the sound contrasts of every human language on earth, not merely the ones being spoken in the room, all of them. A Japanese 6-month-old can hear the difference between an English R and an L. Then, somewhere between 10 and 12 months, the discrimination narrows down onto whatever the child is actually hearing every day, and the unused distinctions drop out of reach. By its first birthday, it has become a native speaker of one language and has permanently lost the ability to hear sounds it could hear perfectly well at 6 months. Nothing has gone wrong there. That is the system working exactly as built, and the child gets a mother tongue out of it, which is not a small return. But the price is exact, and it is paid in the same currency. It gained a vessel and lost the block. There is a version of this that everybody meets in their 20s, usually without recognizing it as philosophy. At some point, you have to choose a field, a city, a trade, a person, and the choosing feels like an acquisition, which it is, and it is also an enormous subtraction that will never be itemized anywhere. Every yes closes several thousand doors quietly and without notification, and you will not find out what was behind most of them. People tend to register this around 40, and what they register is usually not regret about the choice itself. It is a kind of vertigo at how much narrower the range of available selves has become, and at the fact that it happened without there ever having been a moment when it was decided. Which brings the strongest objection in the book's history, and the remarkable thing about it is that it arrives out of the same timber yard. Confucius and the tradition that followed him are not sentimental about unworked wood. Their position is that nobody is born decent, and nobody becomes decent by being left alone, and that the whole apparatus of ritual and courtesy and study and practice exists precisely because character has to be manufactured. You do not find virtue in yourself the way you find a spring in a field. You are shaped into it across decades, mostly by repetition, mostly long before you understand why, and the shaping is not a regrettable cost of the process. It is the process. Shunzi, put it hardest, writing while the book was still settling into its final form, and he reached for exactly the same materials. Warped timber has to be steamed and clamped into a press before it will ever run true. A blunt blade has to be taken to the whetstone. Nothing straightens itself and nothing sharpens itself, and wood left in its original condition simply stays bent, which is not innocence. It is bent wood. His word for the corrective work is wei, meaning deliberate, artificial, worked-up human activity, and it is written as a person standing beside the sign for doing, human doing. Character for character, it is the thing the other book spends 5,000 words recommending the removal of. The two systems are not merely disagreeing. They are fighting over one word and one image, pulling in opposite directions. His named target for the charge of being obsessed with nature and blind to the human was Zhuangzi rather than this book, but the argument lands in the same place, and it is this. The alternative to carving was never freedom, only whatever the strongest person in the room happens to decide, applied to people who were never given the equipment to object. I find this the hardest thing in the book to hold steady, and I should be honest that I have not managed it. The uncarved block is the most attractive idea in the entire text and the one I trust least. Attractive because anybody past a certain age can feel the truth in it, the sense of having been narrowed, of having become efficient at a small number of things and hopeless at very nearly everything else. Untrustworthy because as a piece of practical advice, it is almost unusable. Nobody gets to decline being carved. You cannot unlearn your way back to the 6-month-old's ear. The child with the reflex in its hand does not keep it and would be in serious difficulty if it did. What survives, and it is smaller than the poetry suggests, is a question rather than an instruction. Not whether to be shaped, which was never on offer. Only whether you are still doing any of the shaping yourself, or whether it has been running along on its own for some years now while you were occupied elsewhere. You may notice, if you are close to going under, that a certain amount of the carving comes off on the way down. It always does. The job goes first, then the opinions, then the name, and what is left in the last minute or two before you lose the thread is something markedly less specified than the person who got into the bed. No plans in it, no positions, nothing it is for. You have been there every night of your life and have never once managed to watch it happen. That is the state he keeps pointing at, and it gets delivered to you involuntarily every 24 hours at no charge. Whether it counts when you are not awake for it is a reasonable question, and I have no answer to it. What is certain is that you will come back up in a few hours, reassembled and carved again, with all the specifications restored, which is itself the thing about the world he found most interesting, that nothing whatsoever keeps going in the same direction for long. There is a moment when you are pouring where the water stands above the edge of the glass and has not spilled. It is holding itself up. Surface tension pulls the top layer into a kind of skin, and the skin is strong enough to carry a small dome of water sitting proud of the rim, curved and trembling and visibly wrong. You can see it from the side. It looks like a mistake that has not happened yet. Then one more drop goes in, or the table takes a knock, or nothing identifiable occurs at all, and the whole dome lets go at once and runs down the outside. What is worth noticing is when it fails, not when the glass is nearly full, which is stable and dull. It fails at the exact moment it is fullest, and the thing that destroys it is the last small increment of the thing that was working. He has a line about that. Better to stop pouring, he says, than to fill right up to the brim. And in the same breath, he adds the other half, which cuts deeper. Hammer a point out to its finest, and you will not be able to keep it. That one happens to be metallurgically true, which is not something you can say about a great deal of ancient philosophy. The sharpness of a blade is a function of how acute the angle is at the edge, and the more acute you make it, the less steel there is holding it together. Push it far enough, and you have an edge that will cut anything at all and will roll or chip on its first hard contact. Every knife maker who has ever lived has had to settle on a compromise between sharp and durable, because the two are the same variable pointed in opposite directions. Maximum performance and minimum survivability arrive at the same instant. The word for the general principle is fan, and English has no single term that covers it. It means to turn back, to return, to go the other way. It also means contrary, opposed, the reverse of. Both senses live inside the one character, which is convenient for him and a nuisance for everybody who has tried to translate him. Reversal is the movement of the way, he says, in 6 characters. It is probably the most compressed sentence in the book, and the claim it makes is that the basic motion of things is not forward but around, that whatever travels far enough in one direction begins at the far end to come back. There is a story fastened to this so firmly in Chinese culture that people quote it without knowing where it came from. It is not his. It surfaces a couple of centuries later in a collection put together under the Han, inside the same broad tradition, and nothing illustrates the principle better. An old man living near the northern frontier loses his horse. It wanders off across the border. The neighbours come round to say how sorry they are, and he asks them how they know this is bad. A few months later, the horse comes back and brings a wild horse with it. The neighbours arrive to congratulate him, and he asks how they know this is good. His son takes to riding the new animal, comes off it, and breaks his hip badly enough that he will never walk properly again. The neighbours bring their sympathy. How do you know this is bad? A year after that, the army comes through the district conscripting every able-bodied young man, and 9 in 10 of them do not come home. The son, with his ruined leg, stays where he is. It usually gets told as a lesson about patience, and it is stranger than that because it does not end. There is no final panel in which the accounts are settled. Every position in it is temporary, including the last one, and the old man's question is not rhetorical. He genuinely does not know. Neither does anybody else, and the story is honest enough not to pretend that it stops. The book puts the same thing more tersely. Disaster is what fortune leans on. Fortune is where disaster is hiding. And then there is the passage that has made people uncomfortable for 2,000 years, and ought to. If you want a thing to contract, he says, you must first let it expand. If you want to weaken something, you must first strengthen it. If you want to take something, you must first give it. And then immediately, this is called the subtle light. The soft and the weak overcome the hard and the strong. Read one way. That is a description of how the world behaves, and knowing it is protective. When somebody becomes suddenly generous, look at what is being set up. When your position is being strengthened for no reason you can identify, ask who benefits from your strength later on. Read the other way. It is a set of instructions, and instructions for a very particular sort of person, somebody with the patience to build another person up across years in order to take them apart at the right moment. It is deniable, it is unhurried, and it works. That reading was not invented afterwards by hostile critics. It was made early by people in a position to use it. There is a version of all this that most people meet at least once and rarely mention because saying it out loud sounds ungrateful. You want something for a long time, years, possibly. You arrange a considerable amount of your life around getting it, and then you get it, and there is a window of about 4 days in which it is genuinely wonderful. And then something goes flat that you were not expecting to go flat. It is not disappointment in the thing, which is usually fine and frequently exactly as advertised. It is that the wanting had been carrying more of the structure than you understood, and now that the wanting has switched off, there is a space where it used to sit, and the space is an awkward shape, and nobody warns you. The peak is where the falling away starts. It starts immediately, and it has nothing whatever to do with whether the thing was worth having, which produces a decision the book gives explicit advice about, and it is advice that almost nobody takes. When the work is finished and the name is rising, he says, withdraw, leave at the top. The difficulty is entirely practical. nobody can locate the top from inside it. You establish where the peak was by having already gone past it, at which point the useful moment is behind you, and going now no longer looks like judgment. It looks like being finished. Every athlete who stayed a season too long had heard that advice. So had every one of them who left a season too early and spent the following 30 years wondering. Two things can be said against the whole idea, and both are serious. The first is that the claim, in this form, forbids nothing. If everything reverses eventually, then any outcome at all is consistent with it. Either the reversal has happened or it has not happened yet, and there is no observation anywhere that could count against the proposition. A century of a dynasty holding perfectly steady is not evidence, because the answer is always wait. 2,000 years likewise. And once unlimited time is permitted, the grand principle collapses into the statement that nothing lasts, which is true, which everybody already knew, and which is no help at all in deciding anything on a Tuesday afternoon. The second is harder, and it concerns who the doctrine comforts. The belief that the strong will fall under their own weight is enormously attractive to people currently being stood on, and that is precisely the reason to handle it carefully. It is the most consoling idea available to anyone without power. A great many oppressors have died old and rich in their own beds. A great many arrangements have outlasted every single person who was waiting for them to collapse. Where the reversal comes at all, it arrives on its own schedule. It has never once been in a hurry to assist the people who needed it, and any philosophy recommending patience has to answer for what the patience costs while it is being exercised. What I cannot decide, and I have gone through that passage in a dozen versions trying to, is which way he meant it. Whether to weaken a thing you must first strengthen, it is a warning issued to the vulnerable, or a technique handed to the powerful. The Chinese does not settle the question. The chapters on either side do not settle it. It sits there in a book that otherwise counsels leaving things alone, looking exactly like a method of interference, and the honest answer is that both readings have always been available, and people have taken it in both directions and got results either way. There is one more reversal in this story that nobody saw coming, and it did not arrive until 1993, out of a hole in the ground. Your heart is doing all of this about 70 times a minute and has never once been instructed to. Every beat is a squeeze and then a release, and the release is the longer half. At rest, something close to 2/3 of each cycle is the muscle letting go and filling back up. Most of the work of staying alive turns out to be the part where nothing is being done at all. It has been that way your whole life, and you have never had to attend to a single one of them. In the 4th century BC, a book was a bundle of sticks, bamboo split lengthways into strips about as wide as a finger and roughly the length of a forearm, then cured over a fire to drive the moisture out so that insects would leave it alone, in a process the Chinese called killing the green. Each strip carried a single column of characters written downwards in brush and ink. Notches were cut into the edges, and a cord ran through the notches, binding the strips side by side, so that a finished text could be rolled up like a window blind and carried under one arm. It works well. It is durable, cheap, and perfectly legible. It has exactly one catastrophic weakness, which is that the cord is silk or hemp and the slips are not. Bury a book like that, and within a few centuries, you have several hundred beautifully preserved sticks lying in no order whatsoever, each carrying a fragment of a sentence, with nothing at all to indicate what went next to what. Reading one is a jigsaw with no picture on the box, and every piece is the same shape. In the autumn of 1993, in Hubei province in central China, an aristocratic tomb was opened at a place called Guodian. It had been robbed at some point across the intervening 2,000 years, which is normal, and the robbers had taken the things robbers take and left behind what they had no use for, which included roughly 800 bamboo slips. The tomb dates to somewhere around 300 BC. 71 of those slips carry material that also appears in the Tao Te Ching, arranged in 3 separate bundles that were plainly never one document, running to about 2,000 characters, or something like 2/5 of the book as it now stands. It is by a very wide margin the oldest copy of any of this that anybody has ever laid eyes on. It was already in the ground before the Great Wall, before the Empire, before the man who unified China had been born. And on one of those slips there is a sentence that should not be there. In every edition printed anywhere in the world for the last 2,000 years, there is a passage that runs in substance: renounce benevolence, discard righteousness, and the people will go back to being dutiful and kind. It is the sharpest thing in the text. Those 2 words are not loose general terms. They are the 2 central technical virtues of the Confucian program, the load-bearing pillars of the entire system, and attacking them by name is not a philosophical disagreement. It is a strike on a rival's flag. The character for the first of them, incidentally, is written as a person standing next to the number 2. Human-heartedness, whatever it is that happens in the space between one person and another. It is the most important single word in the Analects. On the Guodian slips, that sentence says something else. As near as the scholarship can render it, it says, "Cut off artificiality, discard deceit, not a word about benevolence, nothing about righteousness, no attack on Confucius anywhere in the line, and in fact nothing anywhere in the entire Guodian material takes a swing at the Confucian virtues at all." There are 2 ways to read that, and both are unsettling. Either the polemic was inserted later by editors working in a period when the traditions had hardened into rival camps with reputations to defend, and the original sayings were never fighting anybody in particular, or the polemic was there from the start, and somebody in that southern state quietly took it out, perhaps because the man being buried with these slips had studied under teachers on both sides and had no appetite for the quarrel. The first is the more likely on the evidence. Either way, the conclusion is identical, and it is the thing that matters. The book moved. It was not handed down intact. It was worked on by people with opinions, and one of the most famous positions in it may never have been the author's position at all, which opens onto something larger and stranger. That tidy picture of Confucianism on one side and Taoism on the other, 2 great opposed traditions running down the centuries in parallel, was assembled after the fact. The word for a Taoist school did not exist during the warring states. Nobody alive at the time described themselves that way. There were teachers and lineages and men walking between courts with ideas to sell, and the boundaries between them were a great deal more porous than any textbook makes them look. The classification everybody still uses was written down in the 2nd century BC in an essay dividing the whole of earlier Chinese thought into 6 schools by a court historian called Sima Tan, whose son inherited the post and the unfinished manuscript and spent the rest of his life completing the history his father had started. The same family that handed down the biography nobody can verify also handed down the categories everybody still uses to file it. Somewhere in the 3rd or 2nd century BC, a person sat down with a brush and a strip of bamboo and wrote one character rather than another. It is worth being that person for a moment, because the moment is so small. He is copying. He may be working from an exemplar, or from several, or from memory, or from a teacher speaking aloud in a room. The line in front of him is about what should be given up, and he writes, or he selects, the word that names his master's rivals in a text that will be copied out of his copy for the next 20 centuries by people who will assume he was transmitting rather than choosing. He almost certainly did not experience it as a decision. That is generally how the largest ones go. None of this touches the question of whether Confucius was right, and this is the point in the story where he deserves to be heard properly rather than held up as a foil. His position was never that ceremony is decorative. It was that the outward form does the work. A person bowing correctly at a funeral is not expressing a grief they already possess in finished condition. They are being carried by a structure that generations built precisely because grief on its own is shapeless and will not get anybody through a Tuesday. You perform the form over and over for years, and the form deposits something in you. Courtesy practiced long enough turns into consideration. Consideration practiced long enough turns into the kind of person other people are safe around. There is no shortcut available, and there is no naturally occurring version, and he had paid a considerable price for that view. By the measure of his own ambitions, he was a failure. He wanted office. He wanted to be handed a state, or a portion of one, and to demonstrate that the thing could be governed his way, and he spent something like 14 years travelling between courts trying to be employed, and was not employed, and went home in his 60s and taught instead. Everything anyone has of him came out of the consolation prize. There is a passage in the Analects where he runs straight into the other view, and it is the sharpest exchange between these two attitudes that survives anywhere. He is travelling and lost, and he sends a student over to two men working in a field to ask the way to the river crossing. The two of them know perfectly well who is sitting in the carriage, and rather than give directions, one of them says, "The whole world is a flood, and who do you imagine is going to change that?" You follow a man who withdraws from particular people. Better to follow men who have withdrawn from the entire species. Then they go back to their ploughing and never answer the question that was asked. The student reports all this. And Confucius, who is old by now and has been turned down by every court in China, says something I have never managed to get out of my head. I cannot go and live among the birds and the animals. If I am not to be among people, then who exactly am I to be among? If the world were already in good order, I would not be out here trying to change it. That is the entire argument in 4 lines. The ploughman is not wrong about the flood. He is simply not proposing to do anything about it, and his hands are clean for the excellent reason that he has kept them out of the water. What moves me about the Guodian slips is not the scholarship, which is patient and slow and will take another century to finish. It is that somebody put them there. 2,300 years ago, a man died in a state that would be conquered inside a lifetime, and the people burying him decided that what he should take with him was a bundle of sticks carrying his teacher's words. And they laid in that same tomb, side by side, texts from both sides of a quarrel that had evidently not yet been invented. He was not sorting them into schools. He had simply kept the things he found useful. That word for benevolence, the one written as a person standing beside the number 2, does turn up in one other place in the book. It is in the coldest sentence anybody in the ancient world ever wrote about the universe, and it is there as a denial. Whatever you were planning to be certain about tomorrow can be a little less certain, and nothing whatsoever will fall over. The people who lifted those slips out of the mud have been arguing about them for 30 years and are in no rush, and the argument will still be going long after both of us have stopped following it. None of it needs your attention tonight. It has waited 23 centuries. It can manage until the morning. There is a dog made of straw lying in a road, and people are walking over it. This is not vandalism, and nobody present is upset. It is the closing stage of a religious ceremony, and every part of what is happening is correct. The fullest surviving account of what these objects were comes from Zhuangzi, a Taoist writer working perhaps a century after the sayings we have been following were circulating, and he sets out the whole arc of the thing. Before the sacrifice, the straw dog is kept in a hamper, and covered with an embroidered cloth. The officiant fasts before he is permitted to handle it. For several days, it is treated with something not far off the reverence you would extend to a person. Then the ceremony takes place, and it is finished, and the dog goes out into the road, where travellers tread on its head and its back, until somebody with a cooking fire comes past and gathers it up for kindling. Somebody plaited it. That part tends to get lost. A person sat down with an armful of straw and built a recognizable animal out of it, well enough made that it could stand at the center of a sacred occasion, knowing the entire time that within a few days it would be under a cartwheel. The care and the disposal were not in tension with each other. They were both part of the same piece of work. Which brings us to the sentence. Heaven and earth are not benevolent, the book says. They treat the 10,000 things as straw dogs. On its own, that is bracing rather than unprecedented. A good many traditions have looked at the sky and concluded that nothing up there is taking an interest. But he does not stop, and the second half is what has kept people awake. And the sage is not benevolent. He treats the people as straw dogs. The word being denied in both halves is the same one, the character written as a person standing beside the number 2, the central virtue of the rival system, the thing that is supposed to occur in the space between one human being and another. It is refused first to the universe, and then, deliberately and in the identical construction, to the best possible ruler. The cosmological half is a description. The political half is a recommendation. Whatever anybody thinks about an indifferent universe, the universe is not taking instruction. A sage is a person. He has options. He can allow himself to be moved by the situation in front of him, or he can decline to be, and this sentence, sitting in a book that a man holding a state was expected to read, appears to be telling him which. Govern the way weather governs. Make no exceptions. Do not become attached to particular outcomes for particular people. Use, and when the use is over, let go without ceremony. Read plainly. That is among the coldest things in world philosophy, and it is worth noticing that the calendar page version of this book cannot survive contact with it. There is no way to print. He treats the people as straw dogs on a card with a heron on the front. The 19th century translators, who mostly loved the text and wanted very much for it to be a gentle document, tended to pad the passage. One of the greatest of them renders the 4 characters meaning heaven and earth are not benevolent, as heaven and earth do not act from the impulse of any wish to be benevolent, which is a considerable amount of extra machinery to install in a sentence that does not have any. And there is a completely different reading, which is also ancient, and which is not a modern attempt to make the thing easier to swallow. The commentary that became standard across China was written in the 3rd century AD by a young man called Wang Bi, and his interpretation turns on what the denied word actually does. Benevolence in the Confucian sense is not general goodwill, it is particular. It is warmth extended to this person here in front of you on account of who they are to you, and it sits inside a whole architecture of graded obligation, more owed to your father than your neighbour, more to your neighbour than to a stranger on the road. Wang Bi's argument is that heaven and earth are not unbenevolent in the sense of being cruel. They are unbenevolent in the sense of being unpartial. They keep no favourites. Rain does not fall harder on the fields of people it has taken to. And a ruler behaving the same way is not being callous. He is refusing to distribute preferment, refusing to convert his private affections into policy, and applying one standard to every person in the state, which from underneath is the entire difference between a government and a court full of friends. On that reading, the straw dog is not an insult. It is the model of a thing that receives complete and undivided attention for precisely as long as it is the thing in front of you, and is then released without clinging when it is not. I have gone back and forth between those two readings for a long time, and what has stopped me settling is not that the evidence is thin. It is that I am no longer certain there is a difference. Consider two judges. One of them treats every defendant identically because she is fiercely committed to equality before the law and would be ashamed of herself for doing anything else. The other treats every defendant identically because he does not much care what becomes of any of them and finds the uniform procedure less bother than the alternative. Their sentencing records are indistinguishable. Their courtrooms look the same from the door. Nobody standing in the dock could tell you which of the two they had drawn, and the shape of their life afterwards would not be altered by the answer. The gap between perfect impartiality and total indifference is entirely internal. It is invisible from outside. It makes no observable difference whatever to anyone it is applied to, and I am not sure it survives inspection even from the inside. If a person spends 30 years training themselves out of favoritism, by what test do they establish at the end which of the two they have become? That is what I find genuinely difficult about the passage. Not that it might be cold, that the warm reading and the cold reading may describe exactly the same conduct, and that the book gives no sign of considering the distinction important. Everybody has been on the receiving end of this. You go into a hospital or a benefits office or any large system that is working properly and you are handled correctly. The forms are right. Nobody is rude to you. The procedure is applied in precisely the manner it is applied to the person before you and the person after, which is exactly what any of us would demand if we were designing the thing from scratch, because the alternative is an arrangement in which being liked determines what you receive. And it feels like nothing at all. It feels, if anything, faintly like being abandoned, and the reason is that you did not walk in wanting fairness. You walked in wanting somebody to be on your side. Those are not the same thing. No system can supply the second without giving up the first, and there has never been an arrangement anywhere that delivered both. I cannot tell you which reading is correct. I have been through the passage in a dozen versions, and in 2 languages. I only half have, and I have talked myself into each position more than once, usually late at night and usually while meaning to be doing something else. What I can tell you is that the argument is 2,000 years old, that serious people have held both sides of it for the whole of that time, and that anybody who hands it to you as settled is selling one of the two. The room you are in is not on your side. It is not against you either. The dark is doing to you exactly what it is doing to the furniture, which is nothing whatsoever, and it is applying that without the slightest variation. And at this hour that is not a bleak thought. It is very nearly the only restful arrangement available. Nothing in here is assessing you. Nothing in here is going to make an exception, and nothing in here has any need of one. The people in that sentence were never an abstraction, though. Somebody wrote it down, and somebody was meant to read it, and the somebody who was meant to read it had a country in his hands. How would you know if you were being well governed? It is a harder question than it looks, because the obvious tests measure the wrong thing. Satisfaction with a government mostly tells you how much attention it has been paying you. Gratitude tells you it has recently done something visible, and the periods in history when people talked most about their leaders are, on the whole, not the ones anybody would choose to live through. In 2003, the Dutch town of Drachten, did something to a busy intersection that most traffic authorities in Europe regarded as reckless. It took everything out. The lights went. So did the road markings, the signs, the priority rules, the pedestrian crossings, and the little metal railings that stopped people stepping off the pavement. What was left was an open paved area where 4 roads met, carrying something like 20,000 vehicles a day, with cyclists and pedestrians mixed in among them, and no instructions of any kind. The engineer behind it, Hans Monderman, had an argument that sounds like nonsense and turns out to be well supported. Traffic infrastructure, he said, removes responsibility. If the light is green, you go, because the light told you to, and you stop looking at the human being on your left. Take the light away, and a driver has no authority to defer to, so he slows down, makes eye contact, and negotiates. Accidents at that junction fell. So did the time it took to get through it. Monderman used to say that when a road needs a sign, the road has already failed. The book has a ranking of governments that puts this arrangement at the very top, and the ordering is stranger than people expect. The best rulers, he says, are the ones the people do not know are there. Next best, the people love them and praise them. Below that, the people fear them. Below that, again, the people despise them. Look at second place for a moment, because that is where the argument actually lives. Being loved is not the prize. A ruler the population adores is already doing too much. He has become visible. He has become a presence in ordinary life. He has arranged matters such that citizens find themselves thinking about him at all. Praise, in this scheme, is a symptom rather than an achievement. It means the government has come into the room. There is a domestic version of the same instruction further on. Governing a large country, he says, is like cooking a small fish. Anybody who has attempted it knows immediately what is meant. You turn it once. Keep prodding and flipping it to see how it is coming along, and the thing falls apart in the pan, and every bit of the damage was done by your attention. So far, this is the version of the book that gets recommended to people. Now, the passages that do not. There is a chapter near the front, and read straight through it goes like this. Do not promote the able, and the people will not compete. Do not prize rare goods, and they will not steal. Do not display the things that provoke desire, and their minds will stay undisturbed. Therefore the sage governs by emptying their minds and filling their bellies, by weakening their wills and strengthening their bones. He keeps the people without knowledge and without desire, and he makes certain that those few who do know do not dare to act. That is not a hostile paraphrase. It is what the passage says in the standard text, in every major translation, with no significant variance anywhere in the manuscript tradition. Empty their minds, weaken their wills, keep them without knowledge. The pairings are worth sitting with, because they are not careless. Bellies and bones are to be filled and strengthened. Minds and wills are to be emptied and weakened. The body is to be well looked after, and the interior life is to be reduced. It is a description of a population kept comfortable and incurious, and it is offered as the proper object of statecraft. Nor is it isolated, which is what makes it impossible to write off as one bad afternoon. Later in the book, those who in ancient times were skilled in the way did not use it to enlighten the people, but to keep them simple. The difficulty in governing people arises from their knowing too much. Govern a state by cleverness, and you are a scourge to it. Govern without cleverness, and you are a blessing. There is no translation problem here either. No lost pun, no ambiguous particle, no scholarly rescue on offer. Two separate passages in different parts of the book, making the same recommendation in plain language. And then there is the picture of the ideal society, which gets quoted often and read carelessly. A small country with few people. There are labor-saving devices and nobody uses them. There are boats and carts, and no one has any occasion to travel. There is armor, and there are weapons, and nobody has reason to put them on. The people find their plain food delicious, their rough clothes beautiful, their simple houses restful. And there is a neighbouring state near enough that you can hear its dogs barking and its cockerels in the morning, and the people grow old and die without ever having walked over to look. It reads as pastoral, and on the surface it is genuinely lovely. Read again as policy and the details change colour. Nobody travels, nobody trades, nobody has any idea what is happening a mile away, And there is one line in the middle of it I have never been able to get past. He wants the people to go back to using knotted cords instead of writing. The man the tradition remembers as keeper of the royal archives is describing his best possible world, and there are no books anywhere in it. There is a defense, and it deserves to be put properly before it is tested. The defenders argue that desire in these passages does not mean wanting things in general. It means manufactured craving, the appetite that display and competition produce in people who were perfectly content until somebody showed them what they were missing. Knowledge does not mean literacy or understanding. It means cleverness, scheming, the calculating intelligence that warring states' politics ran on entirely. On that reading, the chapter is not anti-intellectual at all. It is anti-advertising. Stop dangling status in front of people, and they will stop tearing one another apart to get at it. That reading is available, and I think it accounts for some of what is going on. I do not think it accounts for most of it, because the same book that wants desire reduced also wants travel reduced, trade reduced, tools left unused, and writing abolished. Once you have removed the roads and the books and any news from the next valley, you have not merely calmed people down. You have taken away every instrument they might have used to discover that they were being governed badly. Which is the hole in the whole elegant argument for light touch rule, and it shows up in the traffic case as well. Shared space schemes work well for confident, sighted, able-bodied adults who can catch someone's eye and negotiate. They are considerably worse for blind pedestrians who depended on the curb and the crossing and the signal, and for whom taking the rules away did not produce freedom. It produced a street they could no longer get across. In Britain, the schemes were eventually paused for precisely that reason. A state that leaves everybody alone is a marvellous thing if you are already all right. The rules that feel like clutter to the strong are very often the only structure standing between everyone else and whatever happens next, which leaves a decision more uncomfortable than it looks because a great many people would take the offer. A government that never interferes with you. No forms, no inspections, nobody at the door, food adequate, work steady, the street safe, and nothing whatever asked of you. In exchange, you do not find out very much. There is no news from anywhere else. Nobody explains what is being decided or why. And the question of whether you would like a say does not come up because the machinery for asking has quietly been dismantled. Put that way, it sounds appalling. Put the other way, you are left completely alone and nothing bad happens to you. It is close to what most people say they want when you ask them about politics. It is worth saying in passing that none of this was unusual for the period. Nearly every school of that century was writing advice for rulers, because rulers were the only people in a position to stop the killing, and almost all of that advice concerns managing a population rather than consulting one. Nobody anywhere on Earth in the 4th century BC was proposing that the governed should choose. Holding this book to a standard invented 2,000 years afterwards would be unfair, and I am not doing it. I am only observing that the passages are there and that they are generally missing from the edition on the bedside table. Somebody did try it though, not as a thought experiment. For roughly 40 years in the largest empire on Earth, this book was the working manual of an actual government, and the person who put it there was a woman almost nobody has heard of. You may have noticed, if you have been getting heavier, that it is very hard to be properly indignant at this hour. Outrage runs on fuel and none is being issued. The objection does not stop being correct somewhere around 2 in the morning. It is simply that whatever part of you supplies, the heat has gone off duty, and what is left is the shape of the argument with no temperature in it at all. That is arguably a better condition in which to look at it, and it is certainly a more comfortable one. The most consequential clerical error of the 2nd century BC was made by somebody whose name nobody bothered to write down. A young woman of the Tao family was working as a maid in the imperial palace when a batch of attendants was assigned out to the various princes of the realm. She asked to be sent to a kingdom near where her family lived. The official handling the list put her down for somewhere else entirely, and according to the histories, she wept about it and went anyway, because a palace maid had no mechanism for appealing an allocation. She arrived in a cold northern territory to serve in the household of an unremarkable prince who was a long way from the throne and universally expected to stay there. Then the succession collapsed, in the way successions do, and the unremarkable prince became Emperor Wen. The maid, who had been sent to the wrong province, became his consort, then the mother of the next emperor, then the grandmother of the one after that, and for something close to 40 years, she was the most powerful person in China. What she believed in was this book. The tradition she followed was called Huang Lao, Huang Lo, pairing the sayings of Lao Tzu with the legendary Yellow Emperor and treating the combination as a practical philosophy of rule rather than a collection of poems. She did not keep it to herself. She required her sons to study it and her husband's relatives and the whole of her own clan, and she went on requiring it after she lost her sight in later life, which did not appear to reduce her authority by any measurable amount. And she got what she wanted, which is why this is the one place in history where the argument can be examined rather than merely had. The reigns of Emperor Wen and his son, Emperor Jing, ran from 180 to 141 BC, and the program held steady throughout. The land tax, which had stood at 1 part in 15, was cut to 1 part in 30. Then, in 167 BC, it was suspended altogether, not lowered, suspended, and it stayed suspended for 11 years. A government sitting on the largest agricultural base on Earth simply stopped collecting the main tax on it for over a decade. Labor service was cut back. Court spending went with it. Wen is supposed to have abandoned plans for a terrace on being told it would cost roughly the entire wealth of 10 comfortable households, on the grounds that this seemed a lot of money for a view. And in the same year the tax went, a physician was condemned to one of the mutilating punishments the previous dynasty had used freely: amputation, branding, the cutting off of a nose. His youngest daughter, who was a child, wrote to the emperor. She pointed out that a man who has lost a foot cannot grow another one, that a punishment which cannot be undone leaves no room for a man to reform himself even if he wishes to, and she offered to be taken into slavery in exchange for her father's sentence. Wen read the letter and abolished the mutilating punishments outright. By the end of those 2 reigns, the histories record that the state granaries were so full that grain was spoiling in them, and that in the treasury the cords holding the strings of copper coins together had rotted through from disuse, because nobody had needed to count the money in years. None of which meant the question was settled, and there is one incident that shows exactly how unsettled it was. A Confucian scholar named Yuan Gu was called before the dowager and asked what he made of the Lao Tzu. He said it was the talk of a household servant. She had him put in a pen with a wild boar. Her son, the emperor, who could not overrule his mother and did not want a dead scholar on his hands, quietly passed the man a blade on the way in, and the scholar killed the animal and walked out. Whatever else that was, it was not a seminar. Because the same book had already been read in a completely different direction by somebody with a very different project. When Sima Qian organized his history, he placed 4 men in a single chapter: Lao Tzu, Zhuangzi, a theorist of bureaucratic method, and Han Fei, Han Fay. Modern readers find the grouping bizarre because Han Fei is the most thoroughly authoritarian thinker China produced, the man who supplied the intellectual architecture of the state that conquered everything. He held that human beings act from calculation and fear, that a ruler should never trust anybody including his own family, and that the only dependable instrument of government is law applied without exception and backed by penalties severe enough that nobody experiments. He was also a stutterer, which is part of why he wrote things down rather than arguing them out loud in a room. And inside his collected works, there are 2 chapters explaining the Lao Tzu line by line. They are the earliest surviving commentary on the book that anybody has. There is a scholarly argument about whether he composed them himself, and it does not greatly matter because whoever did was working from inside that tradition and found the text immediately useful. The way it works is disturbingly coherent. A ruler practicing non-action does nothing personally because the machinery does everything. He announces no preferences, so nobody can flatter him. He reveals no desires, so nobody can supply them and purchase influence. He makes no individual interventions, so there is no purpose in lobbying him. He sits at the center entirely still and entirely empty, while the apparatus of law and reward and punishment turns around him without requiring him to touch it. Which is the wheel, precisely as the book describes it, with the hub doing nothing while everything revolves, converted into a system of government by fear. The emptiness at the center becomes a police state's operating principle, and this is not a distortion of the text. It is one of the things the text openly says. Han Fei went to the Western court as an envoy and impressed the king who would shortly become the first emperor. An old fellow student of his, who had trained under the same teacher and now held high office there, understood exactly what a rival of that caliber meant, arranged to have him imprisoned, and sent poison to the cell before the king could reconsider. He drank it. The most complete theory of autocratic control ever written in China was tested first on the man who wrote it. So inside a single century, out of the same 5,000 characters, 2 governments were constructed. One suspended taxation for 11 years, abolished mutilation, and left the treasury so full that the money spoiled where it sat. The other produced a state in which every household was registered and mutually liable, informing on a neighbour was rewarded, and being late to a work detail was a capital offence. Nobody was misreading. That is the part that does not go away. Both sides were quoting accurately and in context from a text that recommends emptiness at the centre and never specifies what the emptiness is for. The dowager died in 135 BC. Her grandson, Emperor Wu, was young and ambitious and had spent his early reign being told by his grandmother what he was not allowed to do. Within a decade, Confucianism was the official doctrine of the state. An imperial academy had been founded to train officials in it, and the Huanglao party was finished as a political force. He then spent the next 50 years at war. The granaries that had filled up while nobody was doing anything were emptied into campaigns against the northern steppe. The coinage was debased. State monopolies on salt and iron were brought in to pay for the rest, and by the end of his reign, the accumulated surplus of 2 generations of not governing had gone. He is reckoned one of the great emperors in Chinese history. He is also the reason there was nothing left. There is a decision in all this that anybody who has run anything will recognize in miniature. You hold the authority. The advice in front of you is to use almost none of it. And the trouble is not that the advice is wrong, it is that it only looks like wisdom afterwards, and only works when things are already going tolerably well. Nobody has ever been thanked for the crisis that did not occur. Those 2 emperors look magnificent from here, and in every year of it, they were doing something that would have destroyed them had it gone the other way. What I cannot establish, and I do not believe anybody can, is whether the philosophy caused the prosperity. Those 40 years came directly after a century of catastrophic warfare, which means the population was recovering regardless, and recovery after a war looks a great deal like good government no matter what the people at the top happen to believe. There is no way to run the other version. The most successful experiment this book was ever given was conducted once, without a control, by a woman who arrived in the right palace because a clerk misread a list. and it would be another 2.5 centuries before anybody stood on a mountain and reported that the author of the book had appeared to him in person, which by then had become possible because by then he was a god. There is an administration running inside you at this moment considerably larger than the one she oversaw. Something in the order of 30 trillion cells, every one of them doing its own work, none of them waiting on instructions, the whole thing coordinated without a single decision ever reaching you. Your temperature is being held steady, your blood is being cleaned. You authorized none of it, and you could not stop most of it if you set out to. The head office has been shut since some time before midnight, and the empire has not noticed. Somewhere in China, at this exact moment, there is incense burning in front of him, not in a museum, in a working temple with resident clergy and an offering box and a queue at festival times, in front of a seated figure with a long white beard and one hand raised in a gesture of instruction. He occupies one of the 3 highest positions in the pantheon. He has a formal title, the Most High Lord Lao. He has a birthday, which is celebrated. He has scriptures that he revealed personally, and a great many people who will tell you, without any irony at all, that he has answered their prayers. The man supposed to have written that anything you can put a name to is not the real thing ended up with a name, a rank, a face, a feast day, and an address. It did not happen all at once, and the early stages are traceable. By the middle of the 2nd century AD, an emperor was building a palace on the traditional site of his birthplace and authorizing sacrifices to him. An inscription carved around the year 166 gives him a full cosmic career. Advisor to the sage kings of antiquity, present at the beginning of things, undergoing a series of transformations down the ages and appearing in different bodies in different reigns. A text from roughly the same period has him transform at one point into his own mother, which sounds like nonsense for about 4 seconds, until you remember that the book he is supposed to have written calls the way the mother of all things. None of the theology was invented out of nothing. It was assembled out of the book's own vocabulary quite carefully by people who had read it closely. And in the year 142, on a mountain in Sichuan, Sichuan, a man called Zhang Daoling, reported that the god had come to see him. The account is specific. Lord Lao appeared, conferred on him the title of Celestial Master, and gave him authority over a new covenant. There was a warning attached, and it was not a gentle one. Plagues were coming, so were demons and wild animals, and the general clearing out of the world. Out of the whole population of China, 240,000 people would be selected to come through it. The seed people, who would be carried into the age of great peace and would populate whatever followed. Everyone else was not on the list. What was built on the strength of that revelation is one of the strangest things in Chinese history, and almost nobody outside the field has heard of it. Zhang organized his followers into 24 parishes, later 28, each run by an official called a libationer. Membership cost 5 pecks of rice a year, which is why outsiders called the whole thing the Way of the 5 pecks of rice, generally with a sneer. Within 2 generations, under his grandson, it had stopped being a sect. It was a functioning independent state in the mountains of the southwest, and it ran for something like 30 years with no governor, no imperial garrison, and no tax collector from anywhere else. How it operated is startling. Illness was understood as the consequence of moral fault, so the treatment for being ill was to write out a confession of what you had done wrong, in triplicate, with 1 copy sent to heaven, 1 buried for earth and 1 sunk in water, and then to sit alone in a quiet room until you had finished thinking about it. Minor offences carried no punishment. Offenders were required to repair 100 paces of road. Killing was forbidden in spring and summer. Alcohol was forbidden outright. And along the roads, at intervals, the parishes maintained free lodging houses stocked with rice and meat, open to any traveller, unattended and unsupervised, with a notice explaining that anybody taking more than they actually needed would fall ill. Whatever anyone thinks of the theology, that is a piece of infrastructure. Somebody read a book about not forcing things and built rest stops. It is worth standing inside the arithmetic for a moment, because the arithmetic is doing most of the work. 240,000 in a population of perhaps 50 million is roughly one person in 200. You have joined. You pay your rice. You go to the quiet room when you are ill, you keep the prohibitions, and you repair your 100 paces of road. And you have no method whatsoever of establishing whether you are on the list. The number is fixed, public, and small. The criteria were never published, and the only available response is to go on doing everything correctly and hope. As a design, it is remarkably efficient. Nobody had to enforce very much of it. The claim that did the most lasting damage came about a century and a half later, and it grew directly out of the one honest gap in the story. Nobody knows where he went after the Western Pass. The record simply stops, and for a long time that was permitted to stand. Then, during a period of open competition between the Taoists and the recently arrived Buddhists, a man called Wang Fu came out of a public debate with a Buddhist monk and afterwards wrote a book explaining what had happened on the road west. Lao Tzu had gone to India. Once there, he had either become the Buddha or taught him. Buddhism was therefore a simplified edition of Taoism, prepared for foreigners who could not manage the original. It is a forgery. It is not a subtle one, and it worked extremely well. The text grew from 1 volume to 10. It served for centuries as the standard weapon in an argument that turned genuinely vicious, and it was banned by 2 Tang emperors who could see where it was going. Then, in 1285, under Kublai Khan, an order went out to burn the false scriptures in the Taoist canon, and this one was first on the list. Every copy was destroyed. It has not existed since. The blank at the end of his life, the one thing in the whole story that nobody had tampered with, was filled in with a lie and then set on fire. There was another cost, and it was paid in bodies. Somewhere across the same centuries, the tradition acquired a fixation on physical immortality and an alchemy to pursue it. The central substance was cinnabar, a compound of mercury and sulfur, prized because it is a beautiful red and appears never to decay. Heating and processing it, which was the entire art, converted the mercury into forms that the gut absorbs more readily. The alchemy did not neutralize the poison. It improved the delivery. Between the 3rd century BC and the 18th century AD, at least 11 Chinese emperors are recorded as having died from elixirs meant to make them live forever. 6 of them were Tang. One of the best documented took the preparations for years, grew steadily more erratic and more violent as the metal accumulated in him, and was dead in 820 at the age of 42. None of this is in the book. There is no elixir anywhere in the Tao Te Ching, and there is no immortality in it either, unless you go looking very hard indeed. Which is where the obvious verdict, a fine philosophy hijacked by superstition, has to be tested, because it does not survive contact with the text. The book is not as clean as its admirers need it to be. It says, the sage can walk through country full of rhinoceros and tiger and take no wound, because there is nowhere in him for a horn or a claw to go. It says that poisonous creatures will not sting the man who holds the way an infant holds it. It says that whoever knows the constant is beyond danger even when the body goes. Those are not delicate metaphors that were coarsened by peasants. They are supernatural claims sitting in the text, in chapters that get quoted constantly for other reasons. And the central subject of the whole thing is described as formless, eternal, prior to heaven and earth, inexhaustible, and the origin of everything that exists. That is not an abstraction politely declining to be worshipped. That is a description with an altar-shaped space in the middle of it, and somebody was always going to fill it. So the honest verdict is not theft. It is that the material was already there, and that a text this compressed and this suggestive will always be taken as whatever the person holding it most needs. Hand it to a working government, and it becomes administration. Hand it to a frightened population in a plague century, and it becomes a covenant with a list of survivors on it. What stays with me out of the whole business is not the god or the forgery or the emperors quietly poisoning themselves in pursuit of a longer reign. It is the rest houses. Somebody in the 2nd century in a mountain province holding a revelation and a tax and a register of the saved also put free rice and free meat beside a road for people they would never meet, left it unguarded, and trusted the entire arrangement to a notice. That came out of the same movement as everything else here. People are not consistent. Religions are not consistent either, and the parts of them that last are almost never the parts anybody was arguing about. The book itself was moving the whole time, incidentally, and not because of forgers, because of copyists and translators, and one man in a silk workshop who counted the characters when he had finished and wrote the total at the bottom of the roll. Nothing needs to be believed tonight. That is one of the quiet advantages of the hour. At this end of it, nobody is asking you to hold a position on anything, and every question that would require a decision has been postponed by an authority you did not have to apply to. The temple will be open in the morning if you want it. So will everything else. None of it is going anywhere between now and then. When the copyist had finished, he counted. We know this because the number is still there. At the end of the first section of one of the 2 manuscripts recovered from a tomb at Mawangdui, in 1973, written in after the last line of the text, is a figure, 3041. At the end of the 2nd section, there is another, 2426. Somebody finished the job, went back over what he had produced, added up the characters, and wrote the totals at the bottom. Nobody knows why. It may have been quality control, or the basis for payment, or simply the habit of a professional who wanted it on the record that the work was complete. What it means is that we possess the exact length of a book whose meaning nobody has ever agreed about. 5,467 characters, checked and signed off by a man in a workshop roughly 2,200 years ago. The material was silk, which tells you something in itself. Bamboo was cheap and ordinary. Silk was expensive, reserved for things somebody had decided were worth the outlay, and it fails differently in the ground. It does not scatter the way loose slips do, but it was folded, and across 22 centuries the folds crack, so the recovered text carries losses running in straight lines where the creases were. The tomb belonged to a young nobleman buried in 168 BC in a family plot in what is now Hunan province. His mother lies in the grave alongside, and she happens to be one of the best preserved human bodies ever recovered from the ancient world, which is what that site is famous for everywhere except among people who read Chinese philosophy. He was buried with his library. Somebody decided he would want it. And the library contained a surprise that took a while to register properly. The book has 2 halves. One is about the way. The other is about virtue, or power, or the particular potency a thing possesses by being fully itself. And the title everybody uses is assembled from that sequence, the classic of the way and its power. Way first, virtue second. Both silk manuscripts have it the other way round. Virtue comes first, and the way comes second, which means that in the oldest complete copies anyone has ever seen, the book is not called what it is called. That is not a filing detail. The order changes what sort of book you are holding. Read Way first and it opens on cosmology, the nameless, the origin of heaven and earth, the thing that was there before things, and the political advice arrives later as an application of the metaphysics. Read Virtue first, and it opens on conduct and rulership, on how a person holds power without closing a hand around it, and the metaphysics turns up at the end as the justification. One of those is a philosophy that turns out to have consequences for government. The other is a manual for government that acquired a philosophy to explain itself. Every reader in the West for 200 years has read the first one. It is not at all obvious that they were right to. The 81 chapters are not original either. 81 is 9 nines, which in Chinese numerology is about as loaded as a number can get, and the divisions everybody navigates by were settled a long time after the words were. The silk texts break the material up differently. The older bamboo bundles do not break it that way at all. Every time somebody says chapter 11, and I have done it more than once tonight, they are using a set of joints cut into the thing by an editor for reasons that were partly arithmetical and partly mystical, centuries after any of it was said out loud. The version that displaced everything else was produced by a boy. Wang Bi was born in 226 and died in 249 of an illness, aged 23. In the time available, he wrote commentaries on the Book of Changes, on the Analects, and on this and the last of them came with an edition of the text attached. His arrangement, his wording, his chapter divisions became the standard. They stayed the standard. They are what nearly every translation into every European language was made from. 17 centuries of readers across the entire world were working from a copy that a 23-year-old finished shortly before he died, and it was not seriously challenged until the silk came out of the ground in 1973. There is something slightly absurd in that, and something rather wonderful. By every surviving account, he was insufferable, brilliant, contemptuous of his elders, the kind of young man who wins the argument and loses the room. And he did the thing that outlasts almost everything else, which was to produce a clean text at the right moment, in a form convenient enough that nobody afterwards could be bothered to go back and check it. After that, the story is one of accumulation. A survey carried out at the end of the 1980s counted 252 versions in 17 European languages, produced between 1816 and 1988. People who collect them now document somewhere between 112 and 124 complete English versions, and that figure is out of date because it is permanently out of date. Two of the most widely read deserve to be looked at honestly because they raise the same question the workshop raised. Stephen Mitchell's version, published in 1988, has sold enormously and is the copy a great many English speakers own. Mitchell does not read Chinese and has never once claimed to. He calls his book an English version rather than a translation, and he made it by working from an 1898 edition by Paul Carus that printed each character with a transliteration and a gloss beneath it, cross-checked against dozens of other renderings. The scholarly objection is real. It brings in vocabulary from Zen and from Christianity, and it produces a book that agrees with its reader considerably more readily than the original does. Ursula Le Guin published hers in 1997 and was blunter still. "This is a rendition," she wrote, "not a translation. I do not know any Chinese." She used the same Carus edition, the one with the characters and the glosses running underneath, and treated it as a key to work against. And the copy she used was her father's. He had read in it for most of his life, and he had asked for passages from it to be read at his funeral, which they were. She went back to the same physical book for decades, eventually made her own version out of it, and said plainly on the first page that she could not read the language it came from. So the question sharpens rather than softens. If the halves were in the other order, and the chapters were imposed by an editor, and the standard text was fixed by a boy who died at 23, and the copy on most English shelves was made by a novelist working from a Victorian crib, what has anybody actually been reading? The uncomfortable answer is a version. a version all the way down, with no original underneath that anyone can get to. There is no point anywhere in the history of this text where you can put a finger on the thing itself, and there is a stranger observation sitting beside that, which I have not managed to talk myself out of. Every person in the chain was, by any reasonable standard, unqualified. A copyist paid by the character who may never have understood a line of it. A young man in his early 20s. A religious movement that rewrote passages to suit its liturgy. Translators who could not read the source. The book was carried for 2,000 years by people with no business handling it, and it arrived anyway, and it is not obviously the worse for the trip. Whatever is durable in it turned out to be durable in a way that does not depend on being transmitted accurately, which is worth extending outwards, because it is not a fact about this book. Every ancient text you have ever met came down a funnel of the same shape, and in nearly every case you have read exactly one version and have no idea that others were ever on offer. You did not choose your edition of anything. Somebody chose for you several centuries before you were born, and then everyone else stopped checking. Most people have a book they love that they have only ever read in translation. The sentences they can quote from memory, the phrases that lodged and stayed there for 30 years. Those were written by somebody whose name appears in small type on the back of the title page, if it appears at all. The rhythm that moved you belongs to that person. A fair number of the images probably do too. This is not a scandal, and knowing it changes nothing that matters. It is only worth understanding once, clearly, what it is you are in a relationship with. It amuses me in a small way that the single thing about this book we know with total precision is its length, not what it means, not who wrote it, not even which half comes first. 5,467 characters. Somebody counted and he was right, and it is the only claim in the whole 2,000-year argument that nobody has ever disputed. There is one sentence, though, that has come through every version without anybody softening it. It is the line saying that the people who understand are not the ones doing the talking, which is a peculiar thing to keep finding in writing, in a book, at the end of 5,000 words. You will not remember this room accurately. That is not a criticism of your memory. It is simply how the machinery works. A recollection is not a recording sitting in storage waiting to be played. It is rebuilt each time it is asked for, out of fragments and expectation and whatever happens to be lying around, and the rebuilt version is what gets filed again afterwards. So every time you revisit a night, you are copying it once more from the last copy by hand. In a year, the version of this room that you carry will have been through that process a number of times. It will have taken on a colour it did not have. The furniture may well have moved. Nobody has ever had access to the original of anything, including their own evenings, and most of that recopying happens while you are asleep, which means it has almost certainly already begun. He went through the gate and kept walking. That is the last thing anybody can tell you. Whatever happened after the barrier came up happened out of sight of every source that exists, and the road he was on ran west into country that the people writing this down thought of as the outside of the world. There is no arrival. There is no settlement at the far end where he is supposed to have lived out his years. No grave anyone has ever claimed to have found. No letter, no student's account of a last conversation. The record carries one more clause and then it stops. No one knows where he ended his life. That is a handful of characters in the original. The historian who wrote them had spent his working life fixing the deaths of emperors to the month, and this was what he had, and he set it down without apology and went on to the next entry. It is worth sitting for a moment with how unusual that is, because almost nobody else gets it. Philosophy is full of endings, and most of them are famous. Socrates has the cup and the cooling legs and one last practical instruction about a debt, And people have been painting the scene for 2,000 years. The Buddha has the grove and the two flowering trees and a final word to his followers about working the thing out for themselves. Confucius has a documented decline, a recorded last illness, disciples keeping vigil and writing down what was said in the room. Even Zhuangzi gets a deathbed, arguing cheerfully with his students about whether it makes any difference if the birds have him above ground or the worms have him below it. Endings are where a tradition puts its weight. The death is the final demonstration, the point at which the philosophy is shown to hold at the exact moment holding is hardest. This one has no scene at all. He walks and the road continues, and that is the whole of it. Whatever the last lesson was supposed to be, there was nobody standing there to take it down, which is either a catastrophic hole in the biography or the only ending the material would have tolerated. A book insisting that the way cannot be caught in any form, that names do not hold the things they are fastened to, and that the best action leaves no trace of having been taken. A book like that cannot have a deathbed. A deathbed is a scene. Scenes have a shape and a moral, and somebody watching. He does the single thing consistent with everything else in the text, which is to go out of the frame. There is a line most people know without knowing where it came from. Those who know do not speak. Those who speak do not know. It is the most quoted sentence in the book after the opening one, and the quiet devastation of it is that it appears in a book. Somebody said it. Somebody wrote it down. It has been reproduced some hundreds of millions of times since, and every one of those acts is the thing the sentence is against, nor is it an isolated slip. The last chapter of the whole work, the one that closes it out, opens with true words are not beautiful, and beautiful words are not true. A book, in its final paragraph, telling you not to trust the manner in which it has been written, and then it ends with something easy to skate past, which is possibly the warmest thing in the entire text. The sage does not accumulate. The more he does for others, the more he has. The more he gives away, the more there turns out to be. About 1500 years after the sayings began circulating, somebody finally said the obvious thing out loud, and he said it in 4 lines. Bai Juyi, Bai Juyi, was among the most widely read poets China has ever produced, a Tang official who wrote deliberately plain verse and who, according to a story told about him ever since, would test drafts on an elderly servant and rewrite anything she could not follow. He was a serious Buddhist rather than a Taoist, which matters here because it means this is not affectionate needling from inside the family. The poem is called On Reading Lao Tzu, and it runs, more or less. That is the entire poem. There is no 5th line in which the difficulty gets resolved. He asks the question, puts the brush down, and leaves it standing on the page, and it has been standing there for 1200 years, and nobody in all that time has managed to knock it over. People have tried, and the attempts are not stupid. The commonest is that the book is a raft, something you use to get across the water and abandon on the far bank, not a description of the bank itself. The words are a device rather than a report. A related version says the text is a finger pointing at the moon, and the error would be to spend your life studying the finger. Another holds that the 5,000 characters are deliberately self-undermining, built to come apart in your hands and leave you holding nothing, which is precisely the intention. I find all of those genuinely interesting, and I also notice that every one of them is exactly what a person would say if they had been caught in a contradiction and needed an exit that sounded deep. The raft argument cannot be checked, it can only be found satisfying or not. So the honest position is that the poet wins on points, that this appears to have done the book no damage whatsoever, and that those two facts sitting next to each other are stranger than either of them on its own. And here is the thing I did not expect to arrive at, which I have been circling for a long while without quite seeing. Every person in this story broke the rule. The man at the center of it wrote a book he had spent a lifetime arguing should not be written, and produced 5,000 characters on the subject of keeping quiet. The official at the gate had no authority of any kind to detain a traveler for philosophical reasons, and did it regardless, interfered, forced an outcome, refused to let things take their course. And had he practiced any of what he was about to be handed, there would be nothing here at all. The copyist in the silk workshop did not leave well alone. He counted and checked and made a record. The boy who fixed the standard text was ambitious and argumentative, and badly wanted to be read. A religious movement rewrote the passages that did not suit it. Translators went at it in languages they could not read. Not one of them left it alone. Every link in the chain is a person doing precisely the wrong thing by the standards of the document they were holding, and the document survives because of it. A book recommending non-interference exists tonight entirely on the strength of 2,500 years of uninterrupted interference by people who could not help themselves. I have never been able to decide whether that is a refutation or a joke he would have enjoyed. There is one more thing I have not settled, and I would rather admit it than dress it up. This book was handed to a working government, and it produced the lightest administration in Chinese history. It was handed to a police state, and it produced a theory of total control. It was handed to a frightened population in a plague century, and it produced a covenant with a list of survivors on it. It was handed to an American novelist in the 1990s, and it produced something gentle and green and very much like her. It does that to everybody. It is short enough and open enough and quiet enough that whoever picks it up finds their own program inside it, confirmed and improved, and 2,500 years older than they are. Which leaves a question I have no answer to. I have spent a long time with this text, and I have come to a reading of it that I find honest, and that moves me. But I have watched it work as a mirror for every single person who ever held it, and I have no procedure at all for establishing that it has not done exactly the same thing to me. Somewhere in what I have told you tonight is the book, and somewhere in it is my own face, and I cannot find the join. What survives all of that for me is smaller than a philosophy and considerably more usable. The one instruction in it that anybody can actually act on is subtraction. Not adding a practice, not acquiring a discipline or a routine or a morning regime. Taking something off, the extra effort riding on top of the work and contributing nothing, the grip on an outcome that was never yours to hold, the last word you were going to have. It says very little about what to do and a great deal about what to stop, and it is the only philosophy I know of whose central exercise can be performed lying down. And there is one place where every person alive succeeds at it, without training every night. You have been doing it since before any of this started. The day comes off in layers, and it comes off in its own order, and there has never been a way to make it happen faster by wanting it to. The plans go first. Whatever you had arranged for tomorrow stopped being vivid some time ago, and is now a rough shape you could not describe properly if anybody asked you to. Then the opinions go. Then the things you were annoyed about which seemed load-bearing at 11 o'clock and have no temperature left in them at all now. Then the names. Then, last, the sense of where your own edges are, which nobody has ever been awake enough to watch happening. None of that requires anything from you. It is being done on your behalf by something that has done it every night of your life and has never once needed to be told how. The old man is still walking. That is the only place the story ever leaves him. Not in a bed, not surrounded, not saying anything final for anybody to write down. Somewhere on a road heading west in the late part of the afternoon, with the pass behind him and the dust settling back onto it, getting smaller and then indistinct and then simply not there. Nobody followed him. Nobody recorded what became of him. The last thing anyone can say is that he was going away and that he was allowed to. You do not have to keep hold of any of this. Not the argument, not the objections, not the question the poet asked that nobody has ever answered. It has managed for 1,200 years without your help, and it will manage until the morning. Let the bed have your weight. It has been carrying it the whole time. There is nothing to decide. There is nothing being asked of you, and there is nowhere at all you need to be. Rest now. Good night. Those who speak do not know. Those who know keep silent.